Well, here we are in Philadelphia, and we're visiting with my good friend and former platoon leader, Cy Crevling. And Cy and I served together in 1968 and 1969 when we were in Charlie Company in the 2nd Platoon. And Cy, thank you so much for taking your time today and driving all the way over here
Not a problem.
to visit with me. And first of all, I'm going to ask you some stuff that I've never asked you before and I don't know about. And that was, where were you born and raised?
I grew up, I was born at Bethesda Naval Hospital. My parents were both in the military in World War II. My mother was in the Navy, my father was in the Army. And they were at, my father had come back from overseas. They were at the Naval Research Lab. That's where they met. So I was born in the Naval Hospital, and my mother got a pregnancy, had just gotten a pregnancy discharge. I grew up both in Washington, D.C., and then when I was about 8, my parents were building a house what's now a mile outside the Washington Beltway, but at the time was the Sticks. There were working farms in the area. And it took them 3 years to build a house because they were building it on weekends and after work. And my mother's pregnant with kids and carrying cinder blocks. My father laying brick, and he did all the brickwork, all the carpentry. Helped the plumber, helped the plaster, and we had a house that I didn't find out till decades later never had a mortgage on it.
Oh my!
Because they were paying as they went.
Sure.
So I graduated from high school in Oxon Hill, Maryland, which is right where the MGM Casino is right now.
What was your childhood like?
It was, for the most part, really good. When we moved out to this country area, we were a bunch of wild Indians. We roamed through the woods all day and went down. We had a Potomac River was right there. We'd go down and screw around at the river and figure out what would float and can we go out on the water. So I had a blast. I enjoyed school. I was born in 1946, so I was on the cutting edge of the baby boom, and all the schools were being overwhelmed with the number of students.
Oh, yeah.
So teachers who the previous year had 15 students had 45 in a class. And that was...
Was this when you went to high school or
every way through the system.
Got worse,
every way through the system.
Yeah.
Now they were building schools like crazy. The whole country was. It wasn't just that area. But
anything remarkable about your high school days?
I was a good student. Got my side, and I tested really well. I figured out, same thing in the Army, I figured out how to take tests. And one of the things I would do is, if it's an hour-long test, 2 minutes before the end of the test, I'd go down column A, zip, 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 and I was going to get 25% of the questions, which would have gotten me into an Ivy League college. But instead I went to the University of Maryland, which was a public school, because my father said, "There's no way, son, that our family's sending a kid to Yale." And I managed to, and it was a good decision on his part, because I managed to fail out of the University of Maryland so fast your head would spin.
So what happened after that?
Well, May of 1965 turned out not to be a good time to fail out of school, because local draft board number 57 was breathing down my neck, and so as a preemptive measure, I enlisted in the Army.
Because you would have lost your draft deferment.
Oh, sure.
Sure. Same thing happened to me. When I quit college, I didn't realize that the college was obligated by law to inform the Selective Service.
Oh yeah, they don't make a mistake.
And it just was almost right after that I got my letter.
And to give you an idea, the draft in June when I went in was like 8,000 men a month nationally. By July it was 48,000. So they knew things were going on. So I enlisted. I desperately wanted to go into Special Forces, and that's what the recruiter said. Okay, you tested. We can do this. There's not an advantage, or there's no reason you can't do this, except technically you have to enlist for airborne unassigned, because they make their own decisions on who they choose. What he didn't say is you had to be 20 years old, and I was 18.
Oh.
And I go to. And in the first couple days in basic training, you watch an airborne demonstration.
Where were we at in basic?
I was at Fort Gordon, Georgia.
Okay.
I did basic, I did infantry AIT, I did a leadership school there. And like in the first week of basic, they have some special forces guys jump out of a beaver or an otter and do a high altitude jump, and then they say, okay, how many guys want to go to airborne school?
Really?
And I'm going, yeah, absolutely. And I'm going, wait a minute, I just signed up for 3 years so I could do this? And somebody else, the guy next to me who has 2 years, he gets to do it too?
You figured it out in a quick hurry.
Not the first time that the Army pulled the wool over someone's eyes. But I, if you can say enjoyed, I enjoyed basic and advanced infantry training. I was meeting all kinds of people I'd never met before. I grew up in basically a segregated high school. All of a sudden, the draft boards were cleaning out New York City and Philadelphia, and the recruiters were cleaning out Florida, to give you an idea of kind of what the makeup was. So all of a sudden, there's a ton of African Americans.
Sure.
That and oh, by the way, the sergeant says get the barracks painted by tomorrow. You got to cooperate with them, and it was a good experience.
Yeah. So you were at this point just an enlisted.
Yeah, I was knee one.
Yeah, I was going to say. So.
However, I made E2 at the end of basic training because I was the outstanding trainee in my company.
Okay.
All right.
So, at that point, were you just destined to go in the infantry, or did you say, wait a minute, maybe I can go to OCS and delay my time going to Vietnam?
I kind of didn't know about what the other options were at that point. It was kind of bizarre. At the end of AIT, which was
Was that Gordon too?
at Gordon,
Okay.
which was basically Thanksgiving of 1965. The jump school was so filled with people at that point that they sent us directly to 1,000 of us directly to the 82nd and the 101st.
That was
Airborne
Fort Campbell.
Division. I was at Fort Campbell at the 101st, and because we were not jump qualified, but were required to wear the uniform, which included the overseas cap with the glider patch, the unit citations, and blouse boots in your dress uniform, they hated us.
Oh yeah.
And it actually had to come down from the division commander. You got to quit harassing these guys. It's not their fault. So what happened was we were there about a month, and then Fort Benning normally shut down for 3 weeks for a cycle over Christmas, and so all the NCOs could go home and take annual leave. So they decided, oh, we'll slot all these guys in there. So that meant all the cadre at the jump school hated us because instead of being home with mama and the kids, they were having to run a class through. But I really enjoyed jump school and had a kind of an interesting incident there, and that's they called us together one day, filled the bleachers at the where the 250-foot towers are, and we had a guest speaker who I recognized. I knew who it was. The guy's name, he was an Army officer. His name was Roger Donlin. He was a First Medal of Honor winner in Vietnam.
Oh.
And he was there with his elementary school teacher to show her. It was part of a spread they were going to do in Saturday Evening Post or Look magazine, one of those. But I was all fired up about that, because we were all true believers. When you jump off, they drag you to the top of a 250-foot tower, and unlike Coney Island, you don't come down on the cable. You just float off where you are, wherever you happen to be, which turns out, if you're not paying attention, you can go in the tower and have your parachute wrap around the tower. Then they got to climb up there and cut you down, which is, you don't want to do that.
You don't get many credits for that.
No. So I went back to Fort Campbell.
And that was part of training. How many times did you get to try that and get the feel for that?
Oh, they just had to do the 250-foot tower once. I got to do it twice just because the way the alphabet ran.
Okay.
And then the last week is jump week, where you jump out of C-130s.
Did they teach you how to wrap parachutes and pack them and all that stuff?
No.
So you weren't responsible for any of that?
No, those are riggers who go to a special school
Okay.
for that. Yeah, you don't get to do that. So I went back to Fort Campbell, and they weren't they had no funds to run jumps at that point. So we were basically pulling post support, meaning you were on guard duty one day and KP the next, and maybe work at the hospital pulling sheets, work at the laundry.
Wow.
And
Are you
it was pretty
actually
miserable.
are you actually qualified airborne at this point, or do you have to jump out of a plane?
Oh, I had jumped out of the plane at Benning. Yeah,
Oh,
you're
you
qualified.
did. Oh,
yeah.
okay. I didn't. I
And-
must have missed that.
And I did make one jump at Campbell, which was a night jump, which was kind of interesting, because you do strip off when you hit the ground. You strip off all of your equipment, and you've got this huge bag with a big heavy zipper on it. You stuff the parachute and all the parachute rigging in that bag, and that goes on one truck, and you climb on another truck. And while we're riding back to the company area on the back of a deuce and a half, I look around and I go, these guys are all dressed differently than I am. They've all got their web gear on, and I don't, because I had stuffed mine in with my parachute. And go to the supply sergeant, and he goes, well, you're going to have to pay for this. He said,
Oh, no.
Or, and in today's money, it's probably $200. And he says, but for a lesser amount of money, he says, I can see if I can find something. and of course, he found something. But at the time, all the active units in the Army were under mandates that if you had qualified on your Armed Forces qualifying test and to hit the cutoff to go to officer candidate school, they had to present a certain number of qualified people to the boards where senior enlisted men and officers interviewed you in a stress interview to go. So you had to talk your way out of going in front of the boards. They didn't have to convince me. I went and passed the boards, and you were given 3 choices of schools, one of which had to be combat arms, either artillery, infantry, or armor. And I picked infantry, but it wasn't my first choice. My first choice was the engineer school at Fort Belvoir, which had just opened. And part of that was because it was about 10 miles from where I grew up. It was Fort Belvoir is just south of Washington, D.C. And in between the wars, all the officer candidate schools closed down except for Fort Benning, Fort Sill. Those are the primary ones. And then they do, if you were going into, say, communication, Signal Corps, you would do the first 8 weeks or 16 weeks at Fort Benning, and then you would go to specialized signal training at Fort Monmouth or wherever they happen to do that. And that's the way they'd run it since Korea, but they realized, okay, we got to set these up. So quartermaster at Fort Lee, transportation, signal, military intelligence, they were just opening these schools up all around the country. And so I actually went through, I was in the 5th class that graduated from Fort Belvoir, which was August of 1966. And that was really interesting because most of the people who were in the first several classes were E5, E6 NCOs who knew engineering backward and forward. They'd been in the Army anywhere between 5 and 12 years. They'd all been to Korea, they'd all been to Germany, and those were very field-intensive training circumstances in that you're in Germany, when it gets dark and they close the rivers to barge traffic, the U.S. Army would start putting up a floating bridge. And this could be wintertime, it could be snowing, it could be raining, it didn't matter. And they would get a bridge up, had to get a vehicle across it, tear the bridge down, and have it ready to open to civilian traffic at first light. And if they didn't, there were huge fines involved. And no company commander wanted to have to explain to commanding general Europe, why they had done that. So these guys were good. They really knew what they were doing. You do this 100 times under all kinds of conditions. You get really good at it. They were now going through OCS. They had a big jump on guys like me who had no engineering.
But had you decided to go to OCS yet?
Yeah, no, I'm saying and when I passed the boards.
Oh, that was what that was for?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, you go before the boards.
Okay.
And I did get orders. and I had to leave pretty quickly. I think I had a couple of weeks before I left Campbell, and during that time I was on post support, and Fort Campbell, for whatever reason, supplied odd, oversized and undersized combat boots to units all around the world. And I got sent there, and the sergeant who ran that operation was a major jerk to me, and basically told me, how to do this. And once he saw that, okay, he can do this, he left. And I said, okay. And so I started matching up. If a guy needs size 14 combat boots, they're just not available to go to the unit supply sergeant if you're in Germany or Italy or wherever it is. So I started matching up, a size 14 and a size 8 and packing them together, or a 2 left feet for size 8s, knowing that. And I'm signing his name and putting a different date on there, so that they're never going to be able to track it back to me. I didn't do that for the Sky Troopers who were in Vietnam, because
So your being a rascal started rather early in your career with the military.
Oh yeah. I started Officer Candidate School started in March of 1966.
That was Benning?
No, it was at Fort Belvoir.
Oh, okay.
And to give you an idea how competitive the school was, we started with 63 people in my class, 63 men in my class, and graduated 19.
Oh my gosh.
So they were, a big chunk of them quit in the first week, because it's very physical, very harassing. You probably get 2 to 4 hours sleep a night for the first month. And you're given insane jobs to do, like they'll tell you, we want the barracks painted by tomorrow. And you have no paint, you have no brushes. You got to figure out a way to do it. And that's what they're trying to force you to do. I thought that was, that was interesting. But the other thing is, because the battalion could take 8 times 3, 24 classes at one time. And there were only, I was in the 5th, so there were a lot of tactical officers, lieutenants, and young captains who had come mostly from Benning, who their classes hadn't reported yet, but they were involved. But to teach them what to do, they had them helping out with the classes that were there, and as a consequence, we almost had one-to-one instruction.
Oh my!
Instruction being, you're doing this wrong. And what makes you think that you could be a lieutenant in the United States Army? You sorry sack, And as I got through that, we had a hard-nosed lieutenant, Bob Levy, who was from Benning, and I started screwing with him. And he actually he enjoyed it. They wanted to see that you push back a little bit. And I'll give you an idea. He knew I'd gone to jump school. And when he had gone to jump school, but he had only made the 5 jumps at Benning, I had made this one critical division jump. And so I made a point of pointing out to everybody that he was a cherry jumper, which is what the school graduates are. And in the mess hall, as the tactical officers were all eating at one end, they're hollering commands down to the tables, which you have upper class sitting at each table and firing questions at you while you're trying to eat. And by the way, you ate sitting on the edge of your chair, last 2 inches of your chair, lifting the spoon or the fork up at right angles, and you messed up, turn in your tray. And so we were all losing weight like crazy. I lost 30 pounds while I was at OCS. But he had me, he said, this afternoon you're going to lead your group singing the airborne song, Blood on the Risers. And so I had to teach everybody this song and get them to be able to sing it. And he called on me, and I had to stand on a chair, and there's maybe 100, there's probably 80 people in this mess hall. And I'm leading the class I'm with in the song while everybody's hooting and hollering and screaming and throwing things. And then I go, sir, request permission for another song. And he goes, what would you like to do? I said, I'd like to sing a Ranger song, sir. And I had this set up, and we sang Smokey the Bear. He's a,
Sure.
for the forest rangers,
Sure.
which wasn't what he expected. And he goes, Crevling, would you believe 100 push-ups? And I said, sir, no, sir. And he goes, what? You wouldn't believe 100 push-ups? This was going to be my punishment. And I said, no, sir, I'd believe 200 push-ups. He says, how about 300 push-ups? And I said, that's not enough, sir. And I bid him up to, I had to do 1,000 push-ups, and you had 24 hours to do them.
Oh, my
so I had the fire watch waking me up every hour, and I'd get out of bed, and I'm humping like this. I mean, I was in pretty good shape at the time, but 1,000 push-ups is still a lot of push-ups
Yep.
to do. But the consequence of that was when I graduated, my first, and you were able to list assignments, I was actually kept at the school as a tactical officer, and which was interesting because I was a second lieutenant, and I was 19 years old, and I looked 14, which was kind of interesting. But at that point, I knew the drill, knew how to do it, and I was there to take another class through as their tactical officer.
When did you get to Vietnam?
Okay, in about January of 1967.
And what was your MOS at this point?
Okay, my MOS was engineer small unit leader.
Okay.
And I went up to, since we were close to the Pentagon, I went up and was bargaining for a slot. It wanted to go to flight school. And they said, no, we're not sending you to flight school. Those are infantry billets right now. And I said, I'd like to go to Ranger school. They said, well, we appreciate your attitude, but same thing. You got to be in the infantry to do that. And then they said, but you can go to jungle warfare school if you want. And I said, sure, because that prior to going to Vietnam. And that was 2 weeks in Panama. That was excellent training. It was all fire and maneuver, camouflage, living on the land. And they, as their motto was, they said in Rangers school has 8 weeks, and they teach you to leap off cliffs and eat snakes. We only have 2 weeks, so we'll teach you to hop off a picnic table and eat worms. And then you'd go out in the field, and you'd have teams of 4, and they'd issue you a live chicken, and they say, here's your dinner, figure out a way to cook it. And you did. You did a lot of cool stuff, like rappelling down waterfalls, went on a zip line across the Chagres River that was maybe half mile long, and it's not like these zip lines that they have now. You could kill yourself if you didn't follow instructions on this one, and people got hurt. And in fact, we did have a guy who was killed in the training. He drowned during the escape and evasion, 24-hour escape and evasion drill, which was the last thing we had to do, where they drop you off in the jungle. You had no idea where you were, and you had to figure out where you were and work your way back, and you had 24 hours to do it.
So pretty interesting training there.
Absolutely.
Okay, and so at what point were you done at being a tech officer like that? And then when did you get your orders to actually go to Vietnam?
Well, I had them when I went to Panama.
Okay.
And,
so you knew where you were going, and
I did. And actually, I was slated to go to the 25th Division, to the 65th Engineers, which are the divisional engineers. In other words, part and parcel of the division.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to Tan Son Nhut in February of 1967, and they said, "Nah, you're not going there. You're going here." And I was sent to the Central Highlands to a non-divisional unit, the 70th Combat Engineers, who were supporting the 1st Air Cav out of Ankay in the Central Highlands.
And what was your job? What did you do up there?
Pretty much the beginning lieutenant job in everything is platoon leader.
Okay.
Where you have, in theory, there's 40 men. There never are that many. And we were building. My job was, or our platoon's job was, we were replacing the bridging that was running on the main supply route from the port on Quy Nhon on the coast up to Pleiku, which was even further west towards Cambodia. There were a lot of concrete bridges. About half of them had been blown down by the VC, and Bailey bridges, the bolt-together steel bridging had been put up using the abutments on either side. But the main goal was to build bypasses around all these bridges. So, number one, in case they got blown down, again, which was easy enough to do. And number two is they were going to bring some gigantic generators up from the coast, being hauled by special haulers that were brought into Vietnam. And these things were so heavy that they were not going to be able to move them across the Bailey bridges. And so we were building, we would build culvert tubes, bolt them together, set them in the stream bed, take sandbags, build a head wall, and then backfill it with earth. And we knew they were going to wash out in the first rainy season, but the idea was to get them done. But this was also my first introduction to infantry operations, because there were a couple infantry squads, I would say, on each bridge, because they were trying to guard them. And one of the things I figured out pretty quickly was these infantry guys, first, as it was a gravy assignment for them. They're not humping the boonies. Yeah. There weren't any big NVA units moving around the area at that time. But the other thing was that just before it got dark and the MPs closed the roads, which were unpaved and just brutally rough, just the way they were all across the country, you would see little 50 and 90 cc Hondas with a skinny little guy riding it, with 2 or 3 very attractive young women all dolled up on the back, and he would be dropping them off at the bridgeheads, and then he would come by each morning and pick them up. And I'm going, wow, they have door-to-door delivery of prostitutes here. This is amazing. This was not something I was prepared for.
Sure.
But there were attacks that were on the road. I was in a convoy that got ambushed, but it was by the enemy unit did it back asswards and ambushed the back of the convoy, so we just kept moving. But one day the road was closed, and right 100 yards up the road there was units from the 1st Cav Division were in a big fight with NVA soldiers, and we were watching as F-100 Super Sabre jets were dropping napalm in there. And as some of these soldiers are moving in and are moving back because they'd been wounded, we're talking to them, and I said, yeah, you're dropping napalm on them. This should be over pretty quickly. And the guy says, these guys are jumping up and firing AKs at these jets when they're coming through. And so that was, those kinds of things were happening on the road. They also had, our engineer unit was running a big operation with Rome plows, which were these armored bulldozers that were built in Rome, Georgia, they wanted to clear the main supply routes back, 100 meters on either side, so that if you got fired at, somebody wasn't putting a rocket launcher right in your face.
Yeah.
And so, they did that. And
why don't you explain for people that are watching that don't know what the process of Rome plowing, like you guys did in the Iron Triangle or the Hobo Woods, where they would go in and explain about how they put the huge chain and.
Well, there were a couple different ways they could do it, and one of them was these bulldozers, which were Caterpillar D7s or D8s, I forget which, had special blades that instead of being perpendicular to the front of the machine, it was at an angle and had a really tough point on it, so they could spear into a tree with it and split the tree like this, which weakened good-sized trees quite a bit. It would also working in conjunction with demo engineers who would wrap C4 around a tree and blow it as near to the ground as they could, and then as you said, they could take chains, and these are big Navy anchor chains, yeah. And stretch them between 2 dozers, and as they pulled them, the chain is looped behind them, and they're pulling it down, and then trees, smaller trees, could just get pulled over. And the idea was that this would kill a lot of the vegetation and remove the cover. The downside was it made a lot of hiding places too, because those trees weren't just disappearing when they hit the ground, and so it was still dangerous.
Did they come in before you guys would do that and defoliate, or after?
I did see from from the air that there were areas that were defoliated, and then they used the plows after that, because once the tree loses its leaves, it's a lot easier to deal with.
Right.
So it was a combination of things were going on, but
How many months, at this point where we just discussed, how long have you been in Vietnam?
this was during the summer of 1967. I'd been there for several months. I was a platoon leader for maybe 4 months, and then I was made the battalion intelligence officer, which, as all my friends pointed out, doesn't mean the battalion intelligence officer, which meant I was the guy riding around in a little armored Jeep with that would figure out engineer resources, like if you needed to upgrade roads. You needed gravel, for instance, and where are we getting this gravel? You're not sending to Home Depot in the United States and they're sending over 100-pound bags.
Yeah.
You're looking for local resources.
A quarry,
there were quarries. There were rock. We had rock crushers there. You needed to know where sand was, sand that's clean enough to make concrete. Where the water crossings are, and the problems. What is the ability of the bottom of a stream to take wheeled vehicles or track vehicles, things like this, and basically it became, I got to go around a lot of different places because of that and see a lot of different operations, and had quite a bit of freedom doing it. There were like a couple of NCOs, and then maybe six enlisted men in the section, and we had 2 or 3 jeeps, these armored jeeps, and we'd also provide additional security for people, or if they needed to get a person to a forward area and there weren't choppers available, they could hop in the jeep and we did things like that. So
No.
I was on the main supply routes pretty much constantly every day.
And I got to ask you, because the engineers that I worked with were from the 65th Engineers, and they were in Cu Chi, but they would sweep the roads, and they would go with us and blow up stuff.
Absolutely.
That doesn't sound like what you...
No.
So is there different...
Yes.
Okay.
And the 70th Engineers were a combat battalion in a construction role.
Okay.
And the 65th were doing what's called close infantry support, and which is what I really wanted to do. So at around October, I came back from R&R. I went on R&R to Hong Kong.
How did that work out?
I loved it. Thought it was really a cool
Did you take
place.
a lot of pictures?
Took a couple.
Mm-hmm.
What makes you ask? No,
No, I mean,
No.
because I went to Hong Kong on my
Yeah,
R&R,
no, I
and
was-
I took a ton of pictures
Yeah.
because it was so much different than anything I'd ever been in. But
Absolutely.
I'd never seen anything like it.
A lot of the vets didn't make good decisions on their R&Rs, and I'm not going to put you on the spot for your missed decisions. But one of the bad decisions they made was they didn't take money with them. Did you take plenty of money on your R&R?
Yeah, it's funny when you mention money. If you translate the money from 1967 to now, it's
Yeah.
a 10-to-1 ratio. So E5s were being paid about $200 a month. That's $2,000 a month, which is not a lot of money in today's job market
Right.
if you're living here, but they were providing you a free sleeping bag and all the sea rations you could eat. Bullets, you got them for free. So, as a single guy, I was rolling in cash. $55 combat pay, that's $550 more than you would make if you were anywhere else in the world. So, yeah,
What did you do with your money? Just save it or send it home, or what were you doing?
Well, they opened up a thing called Soldiers and Sailors Saving Program, which paid 10% interest, which was wildly higher than any other financial institution was operating. And I punched most of my money into that because, you know, how much money can you spend at a PX? You know, I mean, how many candy bars can you buy when you're
How
back
many
in the base
cans of
game?
soda?
Yeah.
But on R&R, you took plenty of cash? The point
Yeah.
was you took plenty of
Yeah.
cash, so you weren't stranded?
And I made some bad decisions there too. One of which being, I was in Hong Kong and knew that they were world renowned for making made-to-order suits, and went and bought about 10 suits of all different types. You know.
Shark skin, remember that was...
I didn't do that one.
That,
I didn't do that one. But, you know, I had blazers, top coats, all this stuff, and, you know, had made it exclusively for Cy Crevling by, you know, and it was some Hong Kong tailor's name.
yeah, sure.
Unfortunately, it was right at a point where fashion had just changed and skinny lapels were really big. And so everything I got, super skinny lapels. If they'd been fat, you could have another tailor bring them down.
Sure.
But I didn't do what one of our guys did, and that was Steve Cucini. He got all Nehru suits.
All
Do you
what
remember?
suits?
Nehru suits.
With
They
the-
were the
Yep.
high button collars, you know, which were in incredibly high fashion for about 10 minutes back in
Yeah,
you know,
you're right.
probably when Steve had left the United States.
That's right.
And so, you know, didn't do that. But so I got back from Hong Kong, and the unit was rotating up to Pleiku. The whole battalion was moving up to Pleiku, which moving a battalion with a lot of heavy equipment is a big deal. You've got dozers, you've got earth movers, you've got
Patrols,
all kind of equipment.
scrapers.
Yeah.
Do you guys have a big semi-truck with just fuel in a tanker
Yeah,
that's going with you? Because how do you fuel all these rigs? if
Well,
you have-
that was a big issue. Is moving fuel around, still is. And the one thing the Army's done is that's changed radically that I figured out during the first Gulf War is now every vehicle, including the aircraft, all run on the same fuel, which I think is JP8, something like that.
Multi-purpose, or
Yeah,
whatever you
yeah.
wanna call
They,
it.
you know, so a Humvee can fuel up the same as an Apache helicopter, you know, which makes sense. But so we moved up to Pleiku, which was radically different than where I'd been because on K, the Camp Radcliffe was very similar to Cu Chi in that it was one huge base camp, but it was all in one, you know, in one perimeter with wire. And I got up to Pleiku, and it was 4 or 5 separate compounds, all with their own perimeters and their own security, but they weren't that far apart. I was on a place called Engineer Hill, and we could see the Camp Holloway, which was the airfield, and it was maybe 1 mile, 2 miles away. And then there was a big Montagnard training center about 1/4 mile from us. And then 2 Corps headquarters, and then 4th Infantry had Dragon Mountain, which was, you know, south of us. So it was a ways south. And at that time, we started supporting operations up and down Highway 14, which ran north and south, including up to Dak To, which was a big issue in November of 1967. There was a big fight going on there, and the 173rd Airborne was getting, you know, they were getting bloodied up pretty good. And I got to do some cool things there too. I had to do a reconnaissance from a special forces camp back to the main supply route, a walking reconnaissance, which meant, you know, we probably had 20 people with us, about 4 Americans, and the rest were Montagnards, armed. But we spent the night at a special forces camp, Polly Kling, west of Khartoum, and a couple things happened there. One is I I went out with one of these NCOs to unload a aircraft, and it was a Caribou had flown in.
Mm-hmm.
And they did something I'd never seen, and that's the pilots weren't, the Caribou had just, that year had been turned over to the Air Force. That was part of the deal. The Army got to have helicopters, but they had to give up their big fixed wing aircraft. They could keep Beavers and Otters, and but they had to, the Caribous, which hold about 20 people, they had to give them up. And so the Air Force was flying those in Vietnam when I got there. But these guys were wearing civilian clothes. And the Special Forces guys are pulling out bags and peeling off money and paying them. And I'm going, aren't we in a, I'm not paying for sandbags and for uniforms and for food, not with cash. And it wasn't until years later I realized that was the CIA's operation.
Air America.
Yeah, it was Air America plane that was coming in there. And only spent one night there, but it was an interesting night because the NCO who was there said, all right, we have this underground bunker, which was pretty substantial, with rooms carved into the earth, and the whole thing was covered with PCP, the steel planking for airfields, and then had probably 6 feet of sandbags on top of it. So it was quiet as a tomb down there. But he said, today is payday. That's what and they were picking up the payroll out there, among other things. And he said, these guys are going to get drunk out of their minds tonight, and then they're going to get pissed because they realize they're risking their lives for the peanuts that we pay them, and we're making 100 times as much money as they are. And he says, they start shooting sometimes. And he says, so your job is, you stand here, and this is in this hallway that's a jagged hallway, maybe 4 feet wide, with earthen sides, no shoring, no sandbags. And he says, we got 3 African Americans here, the rest are Caucasians. He said, anybody who comes down this hallway, if shooting starts, he said, if they're not Caucasian or African American, you kill them. And I thought, this is interesting. And he said, oh, and the other thing is, he said, there are rats in here. And he said, so I'd advise you to sleep with your boots on. He says, or they'll be chewing on your toes. And that night, I thought it was a cat landed on me. I mean, it was like thwomp, and it was this monster freaking rat, landed on top of me. But the good news was nothing happened. The next day, we took this, we worked our way back across the Krong Poco River, and I'm making detailed notes about how much effort and how much material it's going to take to upgrade this road so they can bring in low boys carrying dozers, different heavy equipment so they can upgrade the airfield and harden the special forces camp.
So were the Special Forces guys working out of that camp, and then they would go out and do missions and do whatever the Special Forces guys were doing?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
They had a camp, which was a big triangular camp. They had a whole series of them up and down the Cambodian and Laotian borders, and we were almost at the point, just a little farther north at Dak To. If you went west, you hit Laos, not Cambodia. Coming out of Kontum and Pali Kling, you would still be in Cambodia, but and these men talked about what their life was like, and they'd go on patrols with a couple of U.S. soldiers and maybe 20 Montagnards, and they were monitoring the Ho Chi Minh Trail was one of the things they did. And I recently read a really good book about a Special Forces guy who they had a camp at Kontum, and these guys were flying into Cambodia, they were flying into Laos, and their job was mind-blowingly dangerous because the North Vietnamese had tracker dogs and were chasing them, and they could tell when they landed because they had lookouts and were watching for them, and they'd see a chopper. You could fast rope out of a chopper into the jungle, but they had miles of commo wire laid through the woods, and they were sending teams to chase them. So they were chasing these guys pretty much from the time they hit the ground till the time they left. And one of the skills they got was they learned to fire an M79 grenade launcher over their shoulder, so the tail end guy could be, leaving tear gas or firing
Yeah.
firing grenades without having to turn around and look. So it was totally different than it was as you got closer to Saigon, and there was a big civilian population. There were no civilians living out in this area. And so by the end of my tour, which would have been up in February of 1968, in January, the USS Pueblo got captured off the coast of North Korea. And it was real dicey as to whether there'd be a shooting war break out in Korea. And I had already had orders to go back to Fort Bragg, to the 82nd Airborne Division. And they froze everyone's orders and said, if a shooting war breaks out in Korea, we're just going to take these troops who've been in combat for a year and we'll just form provisional units and rotate them into Korea. And I knew enough geography to know that spending a year near the equator was not going to prepare me to go into Korea in February. And I knew enough history to know that being in U.S. provisional units didn't do well at the start of the last Korean War, and I could just see this would be a terrible situation, and decided if I'm going to die, I'd rather die where it's warm than where I'm going to freeze to death. And so I extended my tour for 6 months and went to the 65th Engineers at that point, which were the company I went to was out of Tay Ninh, northwest of Kuchi.
And what was your job there?
I was the executive officer of the company, which is basically an administrative job. You're in charge of supply, the motor pool, the mess operation, and anything the company commander doesn't want to do. And the company commander was a West Pointer named Mike Stepp, who liked to be in the field. And so, I pretty much was stuck in the base camp at Tay Ninh for most of the time I was there. But we were there maybe about 3 or 4 months before the company went back down to Kuchi and rejoined the rest of the unit.
When you were there, did you get some rockets and mortars and stuff?
Oh yeah, we got that, and one of the disadvantages of being in the field all the time is Mike got shot through the chest with an AK-47, and he survived. And I talked to him after the war. He's in Florida now, a very successful man. But one of the bizarre incident that happened to me there was we'd had a armored unit who'd left a company area and left, among other things, a load of tank ammunition in an ammo bunker, and it was rusting and in really bad shape, so they couldn't use it. And so I was going to put together a detail of the people who were back at the rear, and we were going to go blow up this tank ammo. And when I say in the rear, because the platoons were out with, were broken up, and they were supporting infantry companies. And so we load this ammo up, and tanks fire incredibly heavy projectiles that are, 105 millimeters, 4 inches like this, but they're like huge bullets, maximum amount of propellant in them. They don't put cut bags of powder like they do in artillery. It's direct fire, and when it hits, it just tears the crap out of whatever it hits. So we had to go, there was the Mountain Nui Ba Din, which is the only point on a topo map in that part of Vietnam. Everything else is flat as a pancake.
It showed elevation.
And all of a sudden it goes to 3,000 feet, in this one mountain. And the U.S. had a big signal operation, basically intercepting signals, I'm sure, from whatever radios that the NVA were using, but also relaying. It was literally a relaying operation, so that
like having a modern-day cell tower up on the top of the hill.
Yeah, and it was 3,000 feet in the air. And then at the bottom, there was a specialized engineer unit that ran a rock crusher. And rock crushers turned out to be very valuable pieces of equipment in Vietnam, because you can't build roads with, an upgrade roads, and if you're building airfields especially, you need crushed rock. And so they were guarded. They were guarded very nicely. So we load up all this on we didn't have deuce snaps. We had 5-ton dump trucks, and we loaded up 2 or 3 dump trucks, and we go out there. And I talked to the guy who's the commander at the rock crusher site, and he says, "Yeah, you can go out through the wire over here." And then he says, "Go over that hill," and he says that way it'll shield us. And he said, "Have fun." And so there were probably 5 of us. So we're unloading this tank ammo, which is heavy for among other things, and we're laying it down, and we're setting C4 on it with a det cord, and and timing fuse, and we're lighting it, and then we run as far away as we can, and we hide behind the rocks, and big explosions, and smoke going everywhere, and pieces of rock are showering down on us, and we're just having as much fun as we can. But it's getting late in the day, and I realize, man, it's going to get dark, and we're not going to be anywhere near finished this, and we've already pulled the stuff off the truck, didn't want to load it back up. So we start building bigger and bigger piles of ammunition until finally on the last one, it was probably 20 rounds of tank ammo that were kind of like stacked like
slatted?
Yeah,
Kind of.
like this. And when they went off, not only did it sound like a nuclear explosion, but some of the ones on the bottom propelled other rounds up in the air, and they went off airborne and showered this rock crusher compound with white phosphorus. And it's landing on the crushers. People are dodging it, people are running, and we realized it's time to go. So we jumped in the trucks, and we're hauling ass, and I'm telling the driver, "All right, go, go, go." And he says, "Sir, they're waving us to stop." I said, "Screw them, go." And so we got out of there and get back to the unit, and in about a day, they'd figured out where it came from, and I got a call. The first sergeant said, you better take this call. And so I went up and got on the field phone, and there was the person who was involved with that operation who was just blistering hot. And I explained to him, I said, I know the men who went out there, Captain. And the main guy who did it, I said, he de-roasted this morning. So, there's not much he can do, but I'm telling you, the other men, I will make sure they're punished to the fullest extent of the military law, omitting the fact that I was the guy who was the head of the detail.
Of course.
Why make him upset? But
Or give him another target.
And then in July of 1968, my first 6-month extension was up, and one night I got a burr up my ass and walked across the airfield and walked into what turned out to be the operations room for the 2nd and the 27th, and said I want to be an infantry platoon leader. And they welcomed me with open arms.
I was going to say, how'd they look at you? I mean, they're going, "Come on in."
Yeah, absolutely. It was like, if you're this stupid, we can use you.
Sure.
And it was actually Colonel Odie who was there. He was a major at the time. He was the operations officer. And the funny thing about that was I had to go to a week-long division orientation back at Cu Chi. And that was very bizarre because I'd been in Vietnam for 18 months. And at that point, I'd seen, I'd been rocketed, I'd been mortared, I'd been shot at, I'd seen U.S. troops killed, I'd seen piles of enemy bodies that we'd buried with bulldozers, and I have to go through the basic orientation. But I always took the attitude that the more training you get...
That wasn't what they called the finishing school, was it?
Well, it was the one you went to when you first got there.
That's it. Yeah.
But I'd been there a year and a half.
And you had to go through that?
I had to go through it.
Oh, okay.
And there were I learned some things because I'm paying a lot of attention at this point because I knew, my life and other people's lives are depending on this. And I joined, after I finished that, and of course in the rear I met Calvert and Kelly, Dave Kelly, because they were running the personnel and the supply section out of the rear. And when when we went up to, so I joined the company at Trang Bang, and this would have been like first week in August maybe of '68, and the company was at the Trang Bang Bridge, but the platoon wasn't. You guys were had been up in Tay Ninh, and I think had taken some casualties, and
Yeah, we did.
came in the next day and were real pissed about you'd been supporting an armored unit, and guys got hurt because
Yep.
the tracks were backing over,
Over guys.
yeah,
that-
backing
yeah,
over
that-
wounded guys.
That actually happened.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And so I met Captain Blackwood, and reported to him, and
Of course, we know he was on his way out.
well, I'll tell you about that in a second. And so we were at Trang Bang probably 2 weeks before we moved out. But the next day, the platoon came in, and I met Dick Glover and the rest of the guys who were there. And one of the advantages I had several advantages at that point. One is I'm literally wearing faded jungle fatigues and dirty boots. I had a combat patch. I'd been there for a year and a half. I knew how to use a radio. I knew how to call in artillery. I knew the drill. I wasn't going to look up and say, excuse me, where's the men's room? Like
Sure.
that. I was used to peeing on the ground and all this kind
Yeah.
of stuff that, is kind of a culture shock when you first go
Sure.
out. You go to a place like that. And so I had done all that. Plus I had...
Did you know you were going to be the second platoon leader at that
No.
point? You didn't.
No,
So
that
when you
was-
met Glover and you met all these guys, it was just guys coming in.
No. Blackwood the night before had said, you're going to be a second platoon leader.
Oh, okay,
And,
so you knew.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I met Mike Wunderlich. He was the other platoon leader was there because they were chronically
First
short.
platoon, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They were chronically short of lieutenants because if you look statistically, lieutenants, especially new ones, tend to get shot pretty quickly
They
in
do.
combat units. I mean, they're
You know why?
for a bunch of reasons.
Because they don't know where to stand. They don't know what to do and where to do it in the flanks or the files and so forth. They get, places where they shouldn't be.
Yeah, there are a bunch of reasons, and but while we were there, I got to get my feet wet working out of a fixed location. Spent a night down on the Trang Bang Bridge, which was notable because east of us there was a NVA sapper unit was setting up a big mine in the road, and for the next day. And all of a sudden, there's this tremendous explosion like a quarter mile away from us, and we figured out this guy he touched wire A to wire B.
Yep.
And blew himself up in the process. But if you recall, there was also a lot of traffic on that road at night because the mech units had started running the roads at night. The idea was if we keep somebody on these roads constantly, then it's going to limit the chances of mines being set. And they were running tanks, M60 tanks and M113 tracks, and they had some specialty tracks with them that had 4-deuce mortars in them, and they'd fire illumination rounds up ahead of themselves.
Cool.
And if you know how loud those things are,
Yep.
can you imagine being in what's effect a steel dumpster when one fires? I mean, those guys are all deaf. We think our
Oh.
hearing's bad. They're all deaf, and they would put down as much fire as they needed to because they weren't worried about running out of ammunition because they had
They could
plenty.
they could carry a lot.
a lot more than you can carry on your back. We did a kind of a friendly sweep through a village with the platoon. That was my first time going out with the platoon. And it was one of the villages that was right surrounding us. Remember, there was a graveyard
Yep.
just on the opposite side from the main supply route, and then there was a town. It was the suburbs, so to speak, of Trang Bang. And when we got back, about half an hour after we got back to the fire support base there, there's a Vietnamese older gentleman at the gate, and Blackwood comes up to me and says, your guys stole a bunch of shit from the locals, radios and stuff, it's got to go back. And, all of a sudden, all these, tape players and
Oh, sure.
stuff, started appearing. And, it was kind of one of these, give it back and we won't go any further about this. But I thought, wow, this was another thing that was kind of interesting. We're basically professional thieves, among other things here. But and then a couple days later, I took a patrol out, the platoon out, and we went across the bridge, walked across the bridge, and then cut to the left, and went up and didn't even get into that village when all hell broke loose, and automatic weapons opened up on us. So immediately, and they could see us from the fire support base.
Sure.
And so, Blackwood's on the horn wanting to know what's going on, and I'm giving him the information, and he says, we got a couple gunships gone, and they could only direct fire the 105s that were right at the fire support base, which wasn't a good option for that circumstance. So the gunships came in and started hosing down the area, and the thing I remember most about that was through all this, and they can put down a huge amount of phosphorescence on the tracer rounds, and I mean it's just like rivers of red are coming out of the sky, and through this and through the smoke and all the noise, there is this smashed drunk old Vietnamese guy drinking rice wine or something like that. He comes stumbling through, and a lot of the people are running, trying to get out of there.
Oh, yeah.
And he comes, stumbling through, and we're okay. Keep moving, buddy. But that was my first under fire with the platoon, and I got a big attaboy from Glover, and basically it was, the lieutenant didn't throw up, didn't poop in his pants, didn't pee in his pants, so didn't get anybody killed, so that's a big plus.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
The other thing that happened there was we were getting mortared and put together two and two and realized they had to have a spotter up in the bell tower of this church that was in town. And Glover put a 90 millimeter recoilless rifle round in the window of that, and that brought that to a halt. Mm-hmm. So, and we were after 2 weeks there. We got helicoptered out and went to Crockett, which was east of Cu Chi, and across the main supply route there was a big rice paddy we used for a landing zone, and a dozen choppers come in and they take that many soldiers out, and then another group comes in and takes more out. And about a week after we did that and we were gone, they had a big disaster there because a 50 caliber had been dug in and opened up and was just shooting right down the plexiglass of these helicopters as they came in and killed a bunch of people and burned up a bunch of aircraft. And a week before we'd been those guys. We would have been those guys.
So when you guys moved to Crockett, okay, in that first week is when I and Ray Bourgeois and Russ Bruns joined the platoon. So we walked into the platoon during the first week that you were in Crockett. So, and then of course we were replacements for, the platoon wasn't, obviously it wasn't to full strength, so they were trying to get more guys in there. And, I don't know why, but like in basic and AIT, officers were not, you didn't grow up in the system thinking that you could be buddies with an officer or even approach them really. You just waited for them to tell you what to do. And the first thing I remember is you were sitting on the ground and you were eating sea rations. And I walked up there and you looked and you said, hey, how you doing? And I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that an officer actually talk to me, especially I was a new guy. You know, you didn't know me and so forth. And I learned as we went along that you weren't just like every other officer. You were really different. And you know, I've always said this. I was there for 12 months, so I went through a lot of them. There were either good officers or bad ones, and it just didn't seem like there was anywhere in between. You were either a good one or not a good one. And I'm happy to tell you that you were a good one.
I appreciate that.
You,
I appreciate
you
that.
were truly a good one. So I'm just going to start out by telling you what I remember doing first, and then you can tell, because we were both kind of there new. Do you remember going out to the laterite pits on ambush patrols?
Which direction were they from Crockett?
Well, it was a quarry, a laterite quarry, and then and there was kind of jagged elevation there, and we'd go set up in the in the pits, and right directly across was a village. So there was an open field between our ambush site, and it seemed like we went there more than a couple of times, and but we called it the laterite pits.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't remember that name being used.
And it didn't seem like it was terribly far from Crockett.
There were a couple places we went, and one place was just to the north of Crockett, and we had a night ambush patrol there. And the thing I remember about that is that by that point, Rick Galley was my radio operator, and so we were one of us awake, one of us asleep, and I woke up and when it was my turn to sleep, and Rick was sawing Z's. He'd fallen asleep, which was not uncommon because everybody's sleep deprived like crazy.
Yeah.
And I crawled down the berm that we were on. Everybody was asleep, and that shocked me. You know, I mean, the thought that somebody could just walk right up and the whole, you know, the whole patrol would be wiped out. You know, I remember that well. There were a couple other incidents there at Crockett that went on, but as far as the specific thing you're mentioning,
Yeah, well, that's what we called it. We referred to it as the laterite pits, and I always thought that you took us out there in the beginning because it was not a real dangerous place, and because the village was over there. The objective was the chief and a advisor, a Viet Cong advisor, every once in a while they'd make the mistake of coming out and walking down through that open field. And the objective was, if they were stupid enough to do that, we were going to shoot them.
My last night as platoon leader, which was like the end of last day in September of 1968, we had a mission that because the main supply route running past us and then into Coochie and further on up to Tay Ninh was being mined every night in the village that you had to go through to get up to Crockett. VC were coming in, you know, start pointing guns, grab kids, and say, "Okay, go out and dig." And you know, there'd be 2-foot piles of earth sitting there that had to be probed or had to have mine sweeps done because you couldn't run the risk of running a vehicle across it and find out there's a 20-pound charge in there. And so what we were going to do is, in conjunction with a mech unit that was a mile or so down the road, but the tanks, the main battle tanks, had huge searchlights on them that could shoot either visible light or you know, it was probably infrared. So they could look down there. They could look down, and we were moving parallel to the road, and we're broken down into smaller groups, and we're going to come up to right where we could observe the main supply route in this village. And if these villagers were doing this, the hard and fast rule was sunset to sunrise, you were an enemy.
It's fair.
You were an enemy. But this was making my stomach hurt because I realized killing a couple dozen civilians was not going to be, you know, was not going to do any of us any good.
Yep.
And the operation. So I was, but you had to do it. That's what it was. That's what it was set up to do. And there was a circumstance that happened, and that's we marched. We moved through and it was at night. Moved parallel to the main supply route, and then as it broke up into, our platoon was broken up into two groups. The lead group was Glover, and he went up towards the main supply route, and the tank was out of position, and it was practically where he was supposed to be. So he had moved back down towards where the group that I was running was going to be coming up. And in the meantime, because of that, he'd flushed out a couple of soldiers that you could see. I could see them against the skyline, running and jumping through this scrub, because it was about like chest high vegetation. And they're running along, and all of a sudden they started coming right towards us. And I said, okay. And they were literally towards us, and I could see they weren't carrying weapons. So I wasn't worried that, about that. But we were hunkered down. We were single file, and all of a sudden they just disappeared. And I realized they saw us. They probably saw helmet up against the sky or heard a noise. And in the course of the next couple seconds, my mind is racing, because I'm going, I saw they didn't have weapons, but that didn't mean they didn't have a grenade. And I'm going, okay, I throw a grenade and then try and bring guys online. It's in the dark. I'm doing all the mechanics as fast as I can. And amazing thing happened, and that's just the sky. There was a crash of lightning, and the sky opened up, and it just started pouring rain. It was like monsoon.
It was monsoon.
And when rains that hard hit these broadleaf tropical plants, it just roars, and you couldn't hear a thing. And so I realized, okay, this gives these guys a chance to scoot. And they weren't stupid. They got out. They didn't know how many of us there were, but they knew that it wasn't going to go well for them. And so we were crawling up this hillside, which was just flooded with water. It's coming, water's 4 inches deep coming down this hillside, and there's alternately pitch black, and then lightning's crashing, and you could see. And I'm crawling along, and all of a sudden, I get this feeling that there's other people around me, and I'm just about to shoot, and lightning crashed, and it's Glover's group who'd set up a perimeter that we crawled right through, because it's the middle of the night and all this, so we were all embracing like we were long lost relatives, and we just stayed together, more than happy to have twice the amount of firepower. Like that.
But that was within a breath. That was within a second or two. You could have.
Oh yeah.
You could have squeezed off.
Yeah, It would have been a shoot one of your own people. And I think we had a time when we went on a company maneuver that we sent out a unit out in front and to scout out something, and they came back parallel to us, but to the side instead of coming straight back. And next thing you know, we were firing on each other, and figured out pretty quickly, okay, the tracer rounds are all the same.
Doesn't sound like,
yeah, it's not AKs, ceasefire, and we were just lucky that nobody got killed doing that. But and that's one of those things that people don't realize, that there are a lot of things that can kill you in a war other than the enemy. I mean, you're dealing with dangerous things, explosives, things that catch fire. You're in aircraft. You're having to take chances to do things, and
not to mention you're carrying all kinds of explosives. I mean, I mean, really.
Yep, you got grenades hanging on you. You got smoke grenades. If a smoke grenade goes off and it's attached to your webbing, you're going to be seriously burned.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it could be fatal even. So, yeah, I remember that. I remember that night very well.
And then there was another mission where I think it was called Dodge City West, and they wanted us to go in. There had been a big gunfight the night before with another outfit, and they knew the NVA were in there. I mean, so then they were going to send us in the next morning, and we were going to riff through online. And I think it was a company movement. And we were going slow, and I remember there was banana trees and hooches, and it was just like surreal. It wasn't like being out in the jungle. And I specifically remember where I was at, I looked over and I could see you. And all of a sudden everybody stops and they say, okay, we're going to take 5. We're going to, open a can of peaches or something. And so everybody got down. And I'm assuming, I don't know this, I'm assuming they were trying to talk with each other up there, company commander or the whatever, and try to figure out now what are we going to do. And when we got up, there was a peanut field right in front of us, and it was an open area. And again, before, there was 3 of us, 3 guys, and we walked out into this peanut field. And I looked back over my shoulder, and I could see you in your RTO over there. And of course, we got about 50 feet into the peanut field, and you tell me what from your position, what were you thinking at the time when you knew all of a sudden we were trapped out in the peanut field, for one thing, but
Yeah.
what was going through?
Well, we were on the right side of a dirt road, the berm road that ran from Dodge City West to Dodge City East, and they were maybe 100 meters apart, less than that, 50 meters apart. And we were, as you said, we were quarter of the way across, and all of a sudden automatic weapons opened up on the other side of the berm, diagonally in front of us, and that was Wunderlich's platoon, and Mike Wunderlich was killed, was shot immediately. And so we're down, and when you're traveling with the company, you have a...
And Mike Wunderlich was the lieutenant.
He was a lieutenant.
Yeah,
he was
right.
the only other lieutenant in the field
Yeah.
that day with me. It wasn't until I became the XO that there were, all 3 platoons had lieutenants, assigned to them. And the advantage of traveling with a company is you've got the artillery forward observer is with the company commander, and that was Tom Gardner. And so he can call in artillery, lickety-split, and because he's keeping the units that he knows who's available and what kind of firepower they can do.
And most importantly, he knows where we are.
Yeah.
This
yeah.
guy is,
Yeah,
I remember, he
yeah,
was just a
yeah.
sharpshooter.
Yeah, he was good at that. And so between the artillery cranking up and then them sending gunships out while this fighting's going on, they were able, and then obviously us firing back, this fire got suppressed pretty quickly. It wasn't like there was a huge force there. It could have been 4 guys, but when 4 guys are shooting on full automatic and they're not that far from you and they're shooting right down your throats.
And people are going down.
Yeah, it's pretty it's very unnerving. The radio traffic that I could hear, I very distinctly remember the platoon sergeant saying that he referred to Mike as, he says, my lieutenant's been hit. He said, and he says, we need a medic now. So we sent Doc over there to help out, and because we were in pretty good shape, and they were the ones that were taking the fire. They were taking the injury, the casualties. And then I hear this sergeant on the radio again, and he's distraught, and he's going, I don't think he's going to make it, and that's when I realized that Mike was dying, and he technically he probably died when he first got hit.
Yeah.
But human beings fight.
Yep.
It's all they have. And so he'd been kind of my mentor in the unit for the previous 6 weeks, because he's the guy I could go to that was equal to me, and I could say, hey, there's this situation, and we could talk back and forth, where you don't really go to the captain who's the company commander and bitch about the company commander.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. Right there. But the thing that stayed with me for the rest of my life was the fact that the initial plan was that our platoon was supposed to be in his position, his platoon in our position, and just before we landed, Captain Eichner had gotten on the radio and called and said, the wind has shifted on the ground. We're going to switch the 2 platoons around. Second platoon, you're going to go down the right side of the road.
What did he mean by that?
Well, because the choppers were coming in a different direction.
Oh, the wind had shifted.
Yeah, the wind has shifted. So the choppers,
okay.
instead of, say, coming in like this, and we're piling out and moving this direction, they're coming in the other direction. And the consequence of that was, instead of us walking past each other, we could just all walk forward like that. And from that day on, I realized that if that wind hadn't changed, I would have been the guy getting shot.
Sure.
Because it's you're carrying a map, you've got a compass, you've got a radio telephone.
That was the kicker.
Yeah, you got a guy with a big radio with a whip antenna next to you.
The antenna,
and you're looking and you're pointing and you're yelling and stuff like this. It pretty much says, "Shoot me first," and that's the other one of the main reasons that and that's part of the psychology of a firefight like that is you aim for the leaders, the people carrying the communications gear, and the medics, and
then the machine gunners.
and then start worrying about the other stuff. Because if you can create chaos in the start, it's a big jump ahead. They can't effectively counterattack. They can't. There's a lot of things they can't do. So, that stayed me, and it was literally 30 years later when I said, Mike had an unusual name. His last name Wunderlich, and I knew where he was from, and so I started looking up information and making phone calls, and that's how I got a hold of his brother first, and told him who I was, because it was the 30th anniversary of when he'd been killed, and we were both crying on the phone, and he was, I said, I realize I'm coming out of nowhere for you, but I just want you to know that somebody else has been thinking about Mike all these years. And he called me back in about half an hour later and said, "Would you mind talking to Mike's widow?" And I said, "Not at all. I'd be happy to." And that's when I talked to Jane, and we cried like crazy.
I can't even
imagine.
imagine.
It was just unbelievable. I could barely talk.
Did she want to know exactly what happened?
Not then, but we went. We kept in touch, and about a year later, I'm guessing a year later, she came to town with her sister, Jan, and they had been together in Des Moines, Iowa, when they got the knock on the door that Mike had been killed. And they were packing Jane because she was going to meet Mike on R&R in Hawaii.
Yep.
And because they were married, and they saved those slots for married people. And so she came to town. I met them, and we.
And what town was this?
We're into D.C.
Oh, okay.
And we were gonna,
okay.
And we spent the day together. Went over to Annapolis and had dinner. And after dinner, we were walking around. It was the summertime. We were walking around, and we were over at the Naval Academy, and started asking these questions, and there was a table there, and I asked to borrow a sheet of paper, and I started drawing out the exact situation and talking to him about exactly what had happened. And at the end of it, it was very interesting because Jan looked up and said, I know that's what happened because that's exactly what you said in this letter. And she unfolded a letter that I had written to them in 1968.
Oh my gosh.
Explaining what had happened.
So you must have got her name and address off of one of his letters or something? Or?
No, she had the letter, but she recognized when we talked to each other, she'd recognized my name right away because she had kept the letter. I didn't have her address.
How did you get her the letter?
Well, it was mailed from Cucci.
That's what I mean.
Oh yeah, yeah. I had an address then.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So you must have somehow or another known
Yeah,
where,
yeah. And I knew they were from Iowa, so then we went down to the Vietnam Memorial that night, and a lot more crying too. But then then in 2008, you left a message on my answering machine that I picked up, and he's saying about this reunion, was I this man, and all that, and I was actually at work that day, and I was in a situation where I could eat lunch at home, and so I picked it up then, and the rest of the day my mind is just racing because I realized, you know, I'm going to find out some answers to some questions and how people are, and I called you back that night, and you told me there was a reunion and when it was going to be, and you know, we're firing out names like, you know, Dave Kelly and Jim Calvert and all these names, and you know, I remember Smokes, and you still hadn't located Dick Glover at that point, but yeah, these were all, you know, and it just all comes flooding back, and you know, as I mentioned in one of the reunions, you know, a lot of these guys didn't remember me, and one reason was I was only the platoon leader for 6 weeks, and so that wasn't a lot of time. And the other thing was, as I told him, I said, if I'd have fucked up and got a bunch of guys killed, you'd all know my name.
You'd know, yeah.
You know, so
I have an interesting story to tell you. I couldn't remember your name. I could see you. I could, if you were in a lineup, I'd have picked you out immediately. And I found Captain Eichner. And so he and I were talking, and I kept saying, we had our lieutenant in 2nd Platoon, I can't remember his name. I can't remember his name. And he goes, when was it? And I told him, and he goes, oh, that was Crevling. And immediately, I mean, it was just like a light. We didn't call you Cy, but I mean Crevling, that was it, Lieutenant Crevling. And I go, okay, so now at least I knew who I was looking for.
yeah.
But it was Eichner that actually told me. And when he told me your name, his voice changed. His voice sounded different. And I didn't pick up on it.
Yeah, and there was a reason for that.
Yeah, but I didn't know, obviously. And you know, when I was finding guys, I'd get real excited. I mean, I would just be I'm writing as fast as I can, you know, and on the phone and all this and that and the other. But there was a difference, something about the way he talked after he said your name. And of course, that's how I had the lead. He didn't know where you were at, but I mean, at least now I knew. And I figured, you know, as many phone calls as I made, Crevling is not going to be 500 in the same city. You know, I mean, so I got really good at weeding things out.
Sure.
And
why did his voice change?
well, we'll come to that in a minute. But so yeah, let's get back to the platoon. After Mike got killed, what were we doing after that? Do you remember?
We spent a couple weeks on the bridge across the Saigon River that had been blown down.
Yeah.
Guarding the bridge, there was a big float bridge had been put across.
Was that the Fukong?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I remember that exactly. And I remember because we used to line up on that. It was a flexible bridge. It was a
Yeah, it was a floating bridge.
And we'd throw grenades off of it.
Absolutely.
You know, so we were just doing, and it was fun. I mean, we were seeing who could lob it the farthest, you know, like we were playing baseball.
Yeah, and there'd been a big concrete bridge there that Calvert and I had traveled across it on a supply trip to Tonsanute area, or Benoit, and we traveled across a huge concrete bridge. It was a joint project between Vietnamese engineers and U.S., and this was one of the contract companies that were making millions of dollars, you know, RMK, BRJ, somebody like this, did this bridge.
Johnson Construction Company from Texas.
Could be, you know.
LBJ.
Yeah.
Didn't he make his company build the highway, or is that just a rumor?
It's probably a rumor, but the interesting thing was that we had traveled across that bridge, and nobody had traveled across that bridge after that because it got blown down that night. It was up for 3 days, and the VC blew it down, packed explosives on it, and did it underneath the tank that was sitting up there. So he had an additional, 50, 60 tons sitting on top to stress the bridge. So it blew it down, and I was with the infantry company by then, but it was my old engineer unit that came in and put
That's
this
65th.
that put up the
Yep.
floating bridge that was being used at that point. And prior to us going to that bridge, I'd spent about a week out there. I'd spent some time out there as part of the handoff between the infantry company that was there, which was a different Wolfhound company, I think, and ours, and to learn what was going on and see what their schedule was, and situation like that. So, I was familiar with that bridge, but.
So was Blackwell still the company commander at that point, or when did Blackwell leave and Eichner come in? Do you remember?
Yeah, it would have been. It was in the 2 weeks that that I was at Trang Bang. Thinking full colonel, might have been an assistant division commander who would probably been a 1-star general. Landed and came in a helicopter and got so incensed by the fact that people were not clean shaven, he relieved Captain Blackwell on the spot. And in looking back at it, that probably was an excuse. One of the things that they did in Vietnam that they don't do anymore is it was a rotational game. They moved career officers in and out of slots very quickly, so they could. It was called ticket punching. So
Punch the ticket.
So
Yep.
they could get credit that they led a unit in combat at this level. Then they had this amount of staff experience. They had this much overseas time. They had all these things, and senior officers looked out after their proteges. But the consequence for the unit was that by the time somebody learned their job, and this was
good at it.
Yeah, this was at the company commander and above level, captain and above. They were gone because somebody else needed to get, didn't want to be stuck in a supply depot in Saigon because they knew they weren't going to make general unless they commanded a company in combat. And so Eichner was there pretty quickly, and so I think by the time we rotated down to Crockett, he was the company commander at that point.
And when did you first meet him?
Yeah, I would have met him when he showed up.
What was your impression of him?
He'd been a senior enlisted man. He may have had a direct commission. I'm guessing he had 12, 14 years.
I think he did get a direct commission.
Okay.
I remember that. Yeah.
He had 12 or 14 years or so, I'd say, in the service, and got a commission, and so he was quite a bit older than I was, but and as a general rule, I got along with him fine. And I became, but very quickly thereafter, as I said, I became the executive officer. So I was only marginally dealing with him, although I spent about half my nights, like Jim Calvert said in his interview, we were moving back and forth between the base camp and the field, and we spent nights in the field all the time.
Sure. Did when you left us and you became the executive officer, is that when Jamie O'Brien came in, and
Yes.
did you crisscross then? Did you
Yeah.
hand off the?
Yeah.
Is that
Yep.
how that worked in those days?
Yeah, they actually did a much smarter thing very quickly after I got there, and that's they would have new lieutenants. They would assign them to a completely different battalion to shadow another platoon leader for a week. So they got to do the how do I do this, how do I do that, without having to show their ignorance in front of everybody, which
sure.
everybody's going to do, and then they would put them into the platoon that they actually were going to lead, which I thought was a really good idea. An even better idea in the military is now they move units in and out of combat.
Of course.
There's none of this dribble in, dribble out, which just kills unit cohesion.
Well, we had. I'll never forget. We had medics that were with us. I didn't even know their names before they'd stepped on a booby trap or got shot. I mean, we went through like 3 or 4 medics in a short period of time, and I feel bad about that because I wanted to find them, and so I started asking the guys. Remember that Doc? What was his name? Doc.
Yeah.
No, I mean, they were there so short, such a short time. And so I felt really bad that I don't know. Nobody knows what their name, nobody got close enough to them in a week or two, to have any information on them.
Well, one of the things that happened in going out to the field, I went out one night when the company was west of Cu Chi, and I'm thinking we were at Crockett at the time, but the company had been airlifted in. And one of the consequences was somebody had been killed that day, and he was killed when a short round landed, and I got out to the unit, and everybody was really upset because a guy had been shoveling, bent over, and apparently a piece of flying steel moving at supersonic speeds cut right across his abdomen, and he literally spilled his guts.
Opened him up.
And the other thing that happened that night is I'd taken a Chinook out, and a Chinook got knocked out of the sky that night near Cu Chi when it ran the artillery, outgoing artillery, a 105 round got put into it, which is a disaster. And I'm sure they've got all kinds of digital checks and balances to keep that from happening. But this was back in the, hey, Bob, make sure you tell operations that we're going to be, the flight's leaving here and not to fire during that time period. But helicopters, can't take that kind of hit.
Yep.
And so that had happened, and then we get on the ground, and the deal was in the morning, the battalion, it was going to be a battalion operation, was going to go online across this rice paddy, and where there were a North Vietnamese unit was in a heavily wooded area, and nobody was excited about that because you're walking across a rice paddy and people are dug in, maybe have bunkers, have machine guns, and
You're just waiting for them to open up?
you're just going to get chopped up. And by that point I'd realized whatever we did, we weren't going to win or lose a war. All we could do was get ourselves killed. And I wasn't the only guy who realized that.
Yeah.
And this wasn't a fight to save civilization where you've got we're pushing into Germany to totally obliterate the Nazi army. At this point, everybody pretty much figured out that this is going south really fast, and the U.S. and the military tended to blame the bad publicity they were getting, but I think we all saw that the U.S. Army was completely capable of screwing stuff up on their own.
Oh, yeah.
And nobody, so staying alive became just a big priority. Nobody wanted to be the last guy killed.
Yep. And so when you left and Jamie came in, you became the executive officer. Now, was that normal to leave a platoon and go? Was it kind of a ladder? You'd go from here to here to here to here?
I was kind of forced into it because at that point I was literally the senior lieutenant, first lieutenant in the 25th Division.
I can imagine.
Just because
All your time in.
because and I'd been there a long time, and the Army's not real happy when someone when that gets disturbed. They want the person who's in the executive officer position to be the second ranking person in the company, so they can move into the company commander slot
In case.
In case, exactly. And so I asked to stay to be platoon leader, and they said no, that's not happening. So yeah, Jamie came in, and he was super competent. A couple other lieutenants came in, one of whom one day when I was in the field, Captain Eichner wanted me to go out with that platoon, and because he was pissed at this guy, because this guy was giving off real shaky vibes, and he said, if he does something stupid, or he says, on your say-so, you can demote him,
Relieve
him on the
yeah.
spot. And he said, just continue the mission and then bring him back in, and so that was a situation that I was in, and I went out a couple times with the platoon on night patrols. One night out of Jackson, just before a patrol went out that Jamie was going to take out, the place got mortared and just really got shellacked. and guys said, "Screw this, we're not going out." You know, I mean, they were digging their heels in, and this became a big problem for the Army because they said, "Okay, what do we do here? You know, we can't have this, and we can't have the word getting around that we put up with it either, or else everybody's going to do this."
Sure.
So Captain Eichner grabbed me and said, "You know, go out with them," and because I'd been there, and Jamie was new. Jamie was super competent, I thought. And Jamie insisted. He says, "I'm going to," these are literally the words. He says, "But I'm honcho, right?" And I said, "Absolutely." And it was very bizarre for me because all of a sudden I'm going out on a night ambush patrol, and all I got to do is keep an eye on where I'm supposed to be watching, and kind of tagging along. And I got to tell you, when you're leading an operation like that, the responsibility is crushing.
Oh, yeah.
Because you're keeping a lot of stuff in your mind, and it's your deal. And when you just you're an extra rifle at the back of the column, it's just a totally different. It was a totally different situation.
So, tell me what you tell me what the XO did.
Supply. Anything having to do with supply.
Were you a supervisor, or
In
is
effect.
that basically what
In
was
effect.
a manager, so to
Yeah,
speak?
yeah. It was a much more of an administrative job than it was. It certainly wasn't tactical. But the beauty for me was when I got in there, I had the supply operation, the mess operation ran like clockwork. The supply operation under Jim Calvert ran like clockwork, and Dave Kelly was the personnel guy, and that ran like clockwork. And so, I could see that all I had to do was, stay out of their way,
Sign the
sign the things, and if they came to me and said, "Hey, some E7 has given us a hard time and is not, doing this or that or the other, can you help us out here?" Yeah, that was what I did.
You could play the heavy.
Yeah,
On that.
yeah, I could do that. But being in the rear, one of the thing I distinctly remember is Dave Kelly and I in the middle of November had to go over to Graves registration and ID Freddie Hanna,
Yep.
and that was very unnerving.
Yep.
For one thing, they have you describe the person before you see them, because they want to make sure that
You're just not saying.
that I knew them, and you describe them, and then they had and it was just like a morgue you would see in the United States, except it was in a tropical building, meaning mosquito netting and light wood with a tin roof, but they had a big steel wall, and they went over and they pulled open this 6-foot long like a file drawer and unzipped a bag, and we both had to, we said, "Yeah, that's Fred," and they said, "No, you got to keep looking for a while," and that was heartbreaking. And
Teach at one of the reunions said that was one of the hardest things. That stuck with him throughout his life. In other words, he still has trouble with that one.
And that's why I think it was the 2012 reunion, maybe. On my way out, I stopped and I met with one of his sisters, and we went to his gravesite. And it turned out Freddie was the youngest of 11 children.
Correct.
He was the only boy, and they buried him on his 21st birthday.
Mm-hmm.
From a little town in eastern Kentucky. So, but yeah, so that was part of the job too. And then
Was part of the job if somebody put in a citation or a recommendation for a medal, did that just automatically get issued, or was there some kind of a check and balance for the the citation, the write-up to get a Bronze Star or whatever? Did that somehow or another go through?
well, the person who could type was Dave Kelly, so he was involved in that, and he was also the personnel. He was the company clerk, which in effect meant he was head of personnel, and so he handled all those, and we would talk about stuff like that.
Was there ever any time when you were XO that you challenged any of them, or ever thought that maybe this one didn't sound quite right?
Very bizarre situation. One of the enlisted men came up to me, not a man I knew real well. I don't even think he was in our platoon. and he was really upset. And he said, "Can you tell me?" And he called me. He said, "Sir," he said, "Can you tell me?" He says, "We get a man killed," and he said, and they send an Army Commendation Medal or a Bronze Star Medal home with him, you know, kind of.
Consolation prize.
You know,
I mean, I know that's
yeah,
not the right word.
no,
but
absolutely.
Let's call it what.
You know, to allow his family to say he died a hero.
And they gave him one bump in rank.
Yeah.
If you were a corporal, you went home as a sergeant. If you were private, you were Spec 4. I know that. They did give you a bump in rank.
And he said, "Can you tell me why when we had a company commander who puts himself in for a medal and nothing happened, and he's going to get he's put in for a Silver Star?" I said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, he told me, and I said, "I'll check it out." And I looked. It was a night that there was a small hill, maybe 400 or 500 meters south of Crockett on the way back to the main supply route, and we kept a
Listing
platoon on there at night with. They had and I'd spent the night out there with a tripod-mounted starlight scope, which was
crew
huge.
served.
Huge.
It was a big.
Yeah.
It was a big 8-incher. Yeah.
Yeah, it was big. You couldn't carry it around.
So that hard spot where they had the tripod-mounted crew-served starlight scope was all of a sudden the subject this young man was telling you about. Is that right?
Correct. And I realized there hadn't been anything happen. But I figured out pretty quickly, because I was at Crockett, and you could see down the road, you know, like I said, it was maybe 500 meters, and it was a night that nothing happened, and this Silver Star, recommendation for a Silver Star had been put in for Captain Eichner, that was being rewritten by one of the new platoon leaders, Leininger.
Oh yeah, sure.
And they were doing it like it was an English essay. Okay, we got to make it stronger here, and let's do this here, and it was total fiction. They'd said that Captain Eichner, that the hill had come under attack. It was being it was heavy machine gun fire. He'd ordered everyone into the bunker, and it was basically like he fought off an NVA unit all by himself. And it was horseshit. And so I went to the battalion or the division awards section when I was back in Cucci the next time, a day or two later probably, and I said, "Well, what's the status of this?" And they said, "Well, yeah, it was put in for a Silver Star." He said, "But the way this is written," he said, we're going to up it to a Distinguished Service Cross, which is right behind the Medal of Honor."
Oh my gosh.
And I said, "Look, I wasn't there, but here are the guys who were. Here's what I hear from them." And he said, "Okay, let me walk you over." And I talked to a major in another section in another building back at the base camp, and he is all ears. He's taking this information in. And again, I said, I was not there. I said, but I was close enough, I would have known.
Oh yeah. And
I
plus,
said,
guys came to you.
And I would have.
In other words, you were being told, "Hey, what's the deal?"
Yeah. And I said, there would have been massive amount of radio traffic going on.
There'd have
I
been
said,
air support. There'd have
Yeah.
been choppers flying around.
And they said, "Okay, fine, thank you very much." And the next thing I knew is it took a little while, a couple of weeks maybe, but they were pulling people out of the field and interviewing them. And I said Tom Gardner, the artillery FO, was there. He was a first lieutenant probably by then, and the company radio operator.
I was going to say RTO was there.
Yeah, all the RTOs, and they basically told the same story. And at that point, I realized it was made very apparent to me I was big on the shit list in the 2nd of the 27th Wolfhounds from Colonel Odie on down. Next time I was out at Jackson, I got called to his command tent, which was, I can remember exactly where it was, And he braced me at attention out in the sun, said, "I'll be with you in a minute." And it was like 2 hours. I'm
Oh,
standing
my
at
God.
attention in the sun.
No.
And he called me in, and he just reamed me up and down. Wasn't interested in, why did you do this? Was this true? It was, you did this. You're a traitorous son of a bitch. And, you know, this is, you know, we're not tolerating this. And at that point, there were a couple things I was worried about. I only had about a month left to finish out 2 years. And I was getting feedback from his adjutant, who was a lieutenant, who was the first, who in effect is the personnel person for the battalion,
Yes.
who makes sure that the companies are up to staff and talk to us, that I'm headed towards an ARVN unit, and I'll be on some bridge somewhere waiting to get overrun, you know, surrounded by a bunch of guys who are there with their wives and kids, and you know, like that. And there's that issue. I mean, it's not impossible. It wasn't a deliberate effort just to, disinformation campaign, you know, just to shake me up, and it did.
Before
it did,
that,
believe me.
before that, did you have any at all thoughts of making the Army a career?
I did. I wanted to be a chopper pilot. You know, I'd taken there were a couple of tests you had to take, including obviously a rated pilot, certifying that you're not throwing up in the, you know, and that if they're doing an auto rotation, that you're staying calm and cool and collected, even though it feels very much like you're about to be in a crash. And I'd handled the controls on a chopper, and I realized, okay, that's going to change real quick.
So you did. You thought this incident now is going to change my
Oh,
possibilities.
Yeah. And the other thing was that I was really worried about is the other thing that I didn't mention, that the executive officer of the company is signed for every piece of equipment in the company down to the last shoestring. And if you put it in today's money, if you figure you're 180 people strong, M16s, which currently run about $1,000 a piece or $1,200 a piece, you're talking, you know, a lot of money. You're talking, and by the time you added in the few vehicles, there weren't a lot of vehicles, but a lot of radios and other weapons, it would have been somewhere between $250,000 and $400,000. And I was pretty sure I didn't have that kind of money sitting around. And the problem is when you sign for these things, the person who's previously been signed for them goes, look, I know all this stuff's not here, and I can't prove that.
After you sign?
No, it tells you this as you're looking at, you know, because one of the things they tell you is never sign for equipment without seeing it or having a sub-receipt for
inventory,
it. Yeah,
something.
Yeah. And the guy I'd signed from it for was getting ready to rotate home, and he was, you know, it wasn't here when I got here. It won't be here when you leave. Don't worry about it. I need to go home. Sign here. Well, it's a game of musical chairs, and if you get stuck with the bill, it could be bad news.
If the music stops and you don't have a chair.
Yeah, which is why I eternally grateful to Jim Calvert, because Jim was a supply sergeant, and Jim made magic happen during that. And Jim, I apologize. You know, I brought my poncho home. That's basically the only thing that poncho liner
That wasn't accounted
the
for.
only thing. Yeah, but Jim made it happen so that the numbers worked out right. And and at that point, I kind of was able to. It was the end of January, somewhere in the end of January, early February of 1969, and I was ready to rotate home. I think the fact that I was from 4 miles outside Washington, D.C., and could go to either the Pentagon or go to my congressperson, you know, immediately, without any trouble at all. You know, that might have slowed him down too. But the long and the short of it was, like I said, I was.
Do you think there was anything put in your personnel file?
Oh, I'm sure. I've never seen it. I'm sure I got the worst officer
rating.
It's an OER, officer efficiency rating, and I probably am slightly below Benedict Arnold. would be my guess.
What
But-
happened?
Well, I was gonna ask this, so, now Paul Harvey always says the rest of the story, what's the other side? I mean, you stuck your neck out for truth, for justice, for, you believed in this, or it was the right thing to do. You became a sacrificial lamb, basically. What happened to?
What happened to the medals?
Yeah.
As I understand it, it was resubmitted after I left and approved, but probably not at that high of a level. I just don't know. So I can't give you a definitive answer to that.
And does this really lay claim to the corruption that was in the ranks, unfortunately, that men were more concerned about punching their ticket? Guys like Larry Lemire, who had his sergeant stripes removed 4 times.
Eichner
hated
tore up
his
the thing in
guts.
front of him because he told him to do something, and Larry said no.
Do you think that you think Odie was more concerned that you had turned on one of your own?
Yes.
That was the point.
Yeah.
It wasn't,
yeah.
and it didn't matter.
Whether it was
the
truth or
injustice.
not, it meant nothing to him.
So in his mind, it just keep your mouth shut and don't worry about it kind of thing?
Yeah, it was too late for that. So, but he was.
That's what he would have endorsed.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And my attitude was, I've been able to look myself in the mirror for
Oh,
the last
gosh,
50
yeah.
years, and it's literally I came back from Vietnam 50 years ago last month. So, it's been that long that which is half a century, which just blows my mind.
This is just a hypothetical. Do you think this happened more than once?
I would bet it happened constantly. And there were a couple of things that happened like that. And it makes you understand why people resented officers. There were one is when you see a senior officer today even, and they're wearing 12 rows of ribbons that disappear over the top of their shoulder, you realize, for one thing, a lot of them are what we call tourist badges, and a lot of them were for things that units that they commanded won that they may not have even known about, and that they look after each other. There's no question about it. If a battalion commander drops down his helicopter drops down to help pick up a wounded or to move ammunition around, his aide de camp his second in command is putting him in for an air medal, or a Bronze Star
At least,
with
sure.
V, for valor. There's a lot of that. It's pretty disgusting, because it's not true. And if you say to yourself, the guys who are doing the fighting, how many of them got medals? Yeah, occasionally, if somebody did something really outstanding. Look at how many black soldiers got medals.
Mm-hmm.
Virtually none. Some did, but nobody went out of their way if you were an African American private from Alabama. But if you were a West Point captain, damn right you got put in for medals, because that was a big deal for them. But it's a matter of, can you face yourself? And some people are pretty good at lying to themselves and saying, I deserved it, I did
sure.
I did this, and or I won this, or I was awarded this medal. But so I look at those rows of medals and I go, I don't put that much stock in it. Maybe not.
Yeah, even the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that's some of the funniest ones. I mean, all of these things that you're talking about, even as just a 2-year guy, I look towards the top.
Absolutely.
I look to the top.
Absolutely.
Because that's where the valor stuff is.
Yeah.
And the highest thing that you'll see on some of those is a good conduct medal or
Yeah.
maybe a bronze.
Yeah, I think they should limit all those people to 2 rows plus aviation wings or
Yeah.
or airborne wings or combat medic or whatever it is. 2 rows. And okay, what do you want? You want
Yep.
the bottom 2 rows or the top 2 rows? Well, you get the top 2 rows.
And it almost reminds you of Idi Amin. Remember
Yeah.
Idi
Oh, yeah.
Amin came out and he had to look at the decorations and everything on him, you'd have thought he'd won the Second World War single-handedly. That's an aside. I just came up with that.
Absolutely.
But okay, so you escape excommunication while you're in Vietnam, and you get on the plane and you come home. How much time did you have left to your obligation?
Oh, I was discharged in Oakland.
Oh, so you were done?
yeah,
Oh, that's
I see.
because you extended.
Yeah, I had not only extended, when I went to the Wolfhounds, I had extended past my what was called obligated term of service as when you get commissioned, which was 2 years out of OCS. West Point is probably 4 years, I'm guessing. But I had 2-year obligation, and so from August of '66, August 19th of '68 was the end of, and sometime around the 1st of September, and I think we were probably at Fire Sport Base Crockett by that point. There was a chopper came out, and a guy basically goes to the company commander, and then it comes running over to me and said, "You need to sign this paper," because I was a civilian. You know, I'd been a civilian for a couple of weeks. I didn't know it. I didn't see money as far as a paycheck goes.
Sure.
It was direct deposit, and didn't cost a lot to buy sodas.
Yeah, I know.
And I didn't drink beer, so that wasn't an issue. But evidently, they felt like this would be a huge black eye if a guy is over here basically as a contract employee as opposed to in the Army.
And
So
that's before the contractors were popular.
Yeah.
I mean, that was before they were working.
So I was discharged in Oakland. They give you enough money to get back the plane ticket to wherever you want, and went home. And it was February of 1969, and I was freezing my ass off when
you were not acclimated. You were still in the tropics.
No, it was not fun.
So was there ever any thought, maybe I'll just go into the National Guard or the reserves?
No, at that point I felt like that OER would have looked at me and said, "Get out."
It probably took the taste out of your mouth anyway.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what was homecoming like?
I had a pretty soft landing. All our parents were World War II people. Both my parents were in uniform in World War II. All the neighbors, this guy was in Okinawa, this guy was, in the Battle of the Bulge, like that. So that was not bad. And actually, I went pretty quickly to the University of Maryland, and which became a hotbed of, especially after the Cambodian invasion in the spring of 1970. But I was never treated badly. I was never yelled at. I did stand up in class and say, "Nope, you've got this wrong," whether it was a technical error that was being made or whether it was a big picture misinterpretation. And, and in retrospect, I think and they've admitted it, that the anti-war movement made a fundamental error in not separating the warriors from the political policy.
Exactly.
And they've more than admitted as such, because none of us were there because we woke up one day and said, "Hey, this would be a good idea to go 12,000 miles and fight a country that has never seen, has no idea what we even exist like." And whether you were drafted or enlisted, or in effect, it was a coercion circumstance. People enlisted like I did to avoid being drafted. People went to West Point to avoid being drafted. People became doctors and lawyers to avoid being drafted. And as a friend of mine said, if you think of it that way, really the only people who weren't draft dodgers were guys who were drafted.
That's true.
Yeah. I mean, it was a very bizarre situation. But
going back to what you said, there's a Cherokee Indian saying, and it goes all the way back to when they were in war with the soldiers and all that. And the saying was they would get together before the warrior went out, and they had a ceremony, and they blessed this warrior and asked that God would protect him in the war and so forth. But when they came back from the war, they asked that warrior for forgiveness for sending him into this horrible set of circumstances where their life would be changed forever. And the Cherokee always said, you can hate the war, but don't hate the warrior.
Excellent.
And that's
Can't
what,
put it, yeah, can't put it any better.
and that's what you were, that's what you were saying.
Yeah.
You know, and that's where they made their mistake.
Yeah.
They lumped everybody into the same bucket. And
Yeah.
so, well, what did you do after you got home? Where did you go back to school? Did you,
Well-
did you go pump gas for a while?
One observation is I certainly could have used counseling, and for a bunch of reasons, and I think everybody could. In fact, I think mental illness is a huge problem
Oh, of
in
course.
this country, in the whole world. You know,
Yeah.
we're human beings whose brains were designed to chase an antelope, eat the antelope, and now we're faced with
Doing it again tomorrow.
a digital age that's just unbelievable.
Yeah.
But no, I went back to school on the GI Bill, and was amazingly enough and people said, well, now that you've got the Army behind you, you'll be a good student, you'll be motivated and directed. And I said, I can prove that guy wrong. And I was a worse student than I was when I first failed out of school. I failed out several times. In fairness to me, I was, unlike Jim Calvert, who was, had that cushy little scholastic gig going to med school. I was carrying a very demanding triple major, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and that took up pretty much all my time. And so cracking a book wasn't really part of that operation.
But you were doing well in your three majors.
I did decently in my three majors.
Did you graduate with honors?
I probably graduated with the lowest not only scraped through, but got a degree in general studies, which the school offered for about 1 month until they realized this is a scam. We shouldn't let anybody do this. And, it didn't affect me either way, because I ended up being a blue-collar worker for most of my life.
Let's go there. What did you do?
Tried to be worked as a salesperson, hated that, but kept doing it because it's easier to keep doing what you're doing than it is to change.
Yep.
And finally, I'd kind of run that to a course, and this was probably about 15 years out of Vietnam, and had a marriage falling apart.
I was going to ask you if you were married.
Yeah, I was married. Been married about 7 years at that point.
Any kids?
Have a daughter who's 41.
Okay. What's her name?
Ashley.
Okay.
Who lives in Baltimore. I talked to her over the lunch break and told her, because she was kind of excited about what we were doing here. But, and I saw an ad for, I'd worked for the Postal Service as a clerk in a processing center for a year while I was going to school. And by the way, I wasn't always a registered student. I would just go sit, it was electronic using computerized registration. I just show up and sit in classes that I wanted to hear, and I went on field trips with I literally went to the White House with a journalism course. Had to submit my name for a Secret Service clearance to do that, and they didn't pick up on the fact that I wasn't even a registered student.
That's unbelievable.
And I was pretty much living hand to mouth, which I didn't care.
You weren't living at home, were you?
No.
At least you weren't living in the base.
No. But then I saw in 1984, late to 84, I had realized, oh, okay, I'm pushing 40 years old. I don't have a pot to piss in, and I'm going to be a little old man living under a bridge somewhere in a cardboard box, and something better happen here. And I saw an ad that the Postal Service was hiring letter carriers. And I thought, well, that's odd, because I'd worked as a clerk for the Postal Service about 10 years before that, and letter carriers had such a gravy job. It was like Andy of Mayberry type situation where they'd stop and have coffee with everybody.
Oh, wow.
And guys would race their routes and be home at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I knew a guy who his postal Jeep was parked at the local community college every afternoon, and he was taking classes. His empty mail trays were sitting in his truck.
Sure.
And so so if there was an opening as a carrier, some clerk would jump on it because they wanted to get out of the mail processing
Yeah.
plants where they were under the on a time clock and
Yep,
under the
yep,
thumb.
yep.
So I thought, this is interesting. I wonder what's changed. And I applied for it, got it, and found out the first day what had changed. And that's because 10 years before, carrying mail was a 5-hour-a-day job, and they paid you, and you had to be on the clock for 8 hours a day. And now it was a 12-hour-a-day job or 14-hour-a-day job.
And you got paid for 8.
Well, you got paid, but they badgered and beat you.
Oh, yeah,
You gave
yeah.
up your lunch, you gave up your afternoon break. You were always being chastised for
Not fast enough.
not fast enough, not good enough. And they were pushing out. In the mid-'80s, it was prior to the internet, prior to email, and so everything was going by mail, and there was just mountains of freaking mail. And they had to get people in there in a hurry. And, so my goal was to do this job till I got financially set up, and then something else that wasn't nearly as hard. 'Cause
Where was this in comparison to when you'd gotten married and had your child?
this was after all that.
And
So
so
I
you-
was paying child support. That was
What, do you think the divorce had anything to do with your Vietnam service or your military service?
You'd have to ask my former wife about
No,
that.
I mean-
but yeah, one thing about being in a war, it distorts all your priorities. And my priority was, and you learn some lessons in
Sure you
war
do.
that don't apply later. And one of them that I had figured out pretty quickly was, if you're not being shot at or being mortared, there's no rush on anything. Well, it turns out most employers don't really like to hear that, or they don't want to see you take that attitude. If
Right.
it's, it took me a while to realize, oh yeah, you got to adapt to this situation, and stuff that's important to the people that are paying you, that's got to be important to you, or else you're going to keep stumbling through life.
Sure.
And but a thing happened, and that's I realized that other than the management of the Postal Service, the actual job was good for me. It was a day job. You literally could not take the work home with you, or it was a federal offense. And every day you started over new, which because of my catastrophic long-term planning failure or lack of ability, it played into my hands. And I like the physical aspect of it. And as I tell people, is that in effect, when I was 20 years old, 20 and 21 years old, and a couple of times I was actually a company commander, which is a captain slot, and you had 180 people working for
Right.
you for very brief periods of time. But I was. And then when I'm 40 years old, in effect, I'm a private first class. But it's like the old country and western song goes, life's a dance, you learn as you go, sometimes you lead and sometimes you follow.
That's true.
So, it worked out good for me in the long run. I wouldn't engineer it that way if I was planning, but most of us don't engineer things that well anyway.
How do you view your entire time in the military service, including Vietnam? Was it a good thing that you did? You'd do it again if you had to do it over again? Some of it was good, some of it was bad. How do you look at that overall time of your life?
Oh, I look at it as a good thing. I not only meeting people and experiences, I did take advantage of the fact that because I was in Vietnam for so long, I had 4 R&Rs, and I got a 30-day free leave after my first extension that I flew to Bangkok, spent 10 days there, and then took a wood-burning train down the Malay Peninsula to Singapore and spent 10 days down there. And I kind of figured I'd probably never get back to this part of the world again. And I got to see that, which I think is, was really good. When the first Gulf War broke out, however, I'm reading in the paper, and they were saying, they were talking about the possibility of reinstituting the draft or recalling veterans, and they mentioned that in World War II that they had drafted men between 18 and 45.
Yeah, that's right.
And I was talking to a veteran buddy of mine named Hoyt, and I said, but I don't think they actually drafted anybody who was 45. And he looks at me and says, "The hell they didn't." He says, and it turns out his uncle turned 45 like a month after Pearl Harbor, and when he turned 45, he was in the Army, and he was in an infantry unit fighting in Europe, freezing his ass off at the Battle of the Bulge, and he's almost 50 years old.
Holy
And it's
smokes.
one thing to do what we did when you're 20,
Yes.
but the idea of doing it when you're 50 or
I-
doing it now,
I can't.
You know?
Unbelievable. So, after you got back from Vietnam, did you ever think that, nobody talked about PTSD or any of that stuff, but did you have any characteristics of, like, I heard a story one time you told about that you were delivering mail, and you were walking up to deliver the mail, and a backfire occurred, and you reacted.
Yeah, I'm extremely jumpy on loud noises that are near me, and I've got very diminished hearing because of the service. That's the one thing that, and ringing in my ears that's so loud it's like a steam whistle going off. And one of the consequences of that is even small noises create this huge crash inside your head, and you duck and jump away, and then you realize, oh. Yeah, nobody else is doing
Yeah,
that.
sure,
So
sure.
I probably didn't need to do that either. But, that's kind of the cost of doing business for guys that
Yep.
have been through that. And it's, you think back about it, you don't get to pick the century you're born in or the war you were in. But I can't think of a situation that I would have rather been in. Would I have rather been in the South Pacific in 1944, island hopping? I don't think so.
Yeah, I hear you.
Korea in February during the Korean War, the Battle of the Bulge, and that's just the ones the U.S. were in. You read what went on, like on the German-Russian front in World
yeah.
War II, and you're
Oh, my
going,
gosh.
"Oh my God!" And so I'm consider myself very lucky that I got away without being torn up physically. And the mental parts not so damaged that they're not livable. I'm glad I did it. I've recommended to young men that I think the service is still a great opportunity to learn things. I mean,
And now they pay for kids' college.
they do all kinds of stuff.
Yeah. Just think of what a waste of money that would have been for you if they would have paid for your college.
Oh, they did. They did. They did. As a matter of fact, since we're past the statute of limitations here, is when I told you when I was sitting in, I went for a whole year without being a registered student. They were sending me checks for the GI Bill the whole time. Well, then when I went back to being a student and I did finish up, they said, no, we already gave you the money, so screw you. Like that.
So, as life went on, did you ever, I've been there 3 times, married, and you were married once. Did you ever think, maybe just being alone all the time isn't quite as what it's hopped up to be? Did you ever start looking and getting back in the dating game and all that stuff? How did that work out?
Oh, I was terrible at it. And when I went back, when I was a student, and I went back, I had my own apartment. It was right a couple miles from the campus at College Park. And I was a few years older, and I had GI money, and I had a job, so I was pretty, I was in good shape there. And go out with some young lady and bring her back to the apartment, and things are getting friendlier, and she'd look around and go, see something, and she'd go, "Oh, you were in Vietnam?" And 3 hours later, she's sitting up against a wall, shaking like this, and I've got 4 feet of blood and guts in the room, and I'm going, the horror. And so that probably is not the best way to do that.
Sure. And that happened more than once?
I would imagine.
Just on the ones that he didn't want to see the next day.
No. This was,
No, you were trying. I mean,
I
you were
was-
seriously prospecting.
I was trying. Yes.
Yeah. So when did something work out for you?
It was like I met the woman I married in 1974. and we hit it off. Her father was a colonel in the Air Force, and he'd actually been shot down the day after D-Day and captured by the Germans.
Oh my gosh.
And so, even though I was pretty scruffy looking in those days, hair down to my shoulders and a mountain man beard, and I'm sure he wasn't as pleased as he would have been if a button-down lawyer had showed up with.
Sure. Oh yeah. Sure.
But now I'm in that situation with my daughter, of course. But I probably wasn't any big prize. But he respected what I'd done, and I've always found that to be true. If you're very straightforward with people, you're not blowing smoke up their ass. You just tell them straightforwardly about what you did, when you were doing it. The military still does get a lot of respect in that fashion, because there are a ton of people who say, I could have never done that. Even if I was running a tiny PX in the safest in Cameron Bay, I could have never done that. And you're saying, well, I did do these things.
You bet.
And I'm proud of the fact I did. I'm proud of I never did anything that I had to worry that I was going to be prosecuted for war crimes on, even if it meant taking somewhat of a risk. And there were a couple times that happened. But I can live with myself, and so glad I did it.
How did that marriage work? How long were you married to that lady? How quick?
7 years, I think it was.
Okay.
Yeah, it was not not an immediate point of time. And interestingly enough, I met the guy that she was married. She's been married a couple times since then, and I met one of the guys one time when I was taking my daughter back, and we just happened to be going to eat and saw the guy that was engaged to my former wife, and we sat down and talked. And within 10 minutes, I'd figured out that he had gone to Fort Benning. He had been commissioned as an infantry lieutenant. He was in the 101st Airborne Division.
My gosh.
And I looked at my daughter when we left, and I said, does your mom know any of that? And my daughter looked at me and said, she hasn't got a clue, Dad. That marriage didn't last either.
Yeah.
So.
So after that wife, then what happened? You were still trying.
No, I did move back at home, and because I was basically destitute, because I lost a sales job and lost a family at the same time, and this was about 1981, 82, somewhere in there, and ended up seeing literally the girl next door who I'd grown up with, knew her. We pretty much did not like each other we played together as kids, but by the time we were in junior high school, it was like, didn't want to have anything to do with each other. And we've been together for about 35 years now.
And her name is?
Carol.
Carol, yeah.
Yeah.
So but you didn't get married.
No, and that was her choice. She'd been married a couple times, and basically it supported guys while they either went to school or did other things, and and left with the shirt on, the clothes on her back, and said, I'm not doing this if you're okay with that. And I said, well, we weren't planning to have children together. So
Did she have any kids?
She had no children.
Okay, so there wasn't any.
Yeah, it wasn't an issue there. She's probably wondering where I am right about now.
And but that's a great run. So you two have really figured out how to do this.
No, she thinks I'm an asshole now again.
Oh, so is it kind of a full?
Yeah, it's a full circle. It's gone full circle. She don't want to have anything to do with me. But we got the mechanics down. We can, we can support each other in the ways that old people support each other. And
Sure. That's a great story. That's awesome. Is there anything about your Vietnam service that I haven't brought up or we haven't talked about that is important to you?
I'm sure that on my way driving home, I'll think, oh my God, that was the perfect opening.
Well, if you do, what we'll do is we'll have you get with Tim and we'll do a phone deal, and then Tim had a great idea. You could tape that, and we could run that, and he could sit next to me with his hand behind my back, and I can go. and we'll just finish the we'll just finish the interview.
That's pretty hilarious.
I had a question for you, because I know there's a few more and then you're gonna land the plane. What is your, now I don't mean, two ways to take this question. Number one, entertainment value. What is your favorite all-time military movie? And then accuracy value, like true to war culture, any of that. Do you have any, like, tell me some of your favorite movies like that.
Well, I'll tell you one that was the least accurate, and I actually saw it in the battalion area in Cu Chi, which was outdoors on a 16 millimeter.
Oh yes, I remember those.
Yes,
sure.
they had a 16 millimeter
with a
projector.
sheet on the
Yep.
side of a building.
And the experience wasn't ideal in that these guys would run the reels out of order, and the machines, you know, and after 20 minutes, all of a sudden the credits would be running after, and you're really confused as to what the. I mean, this was constantly like that. Or else, all of a sudden, the picture would freeze, and the next thing you'd see in the very center, you'd see a brown spot that would get bigger, and you'd hear crackling, and it would literally burning a hole in the film.
Oh, it got stuck in the bulb, the heat of the bulb. Oh, I remember that happening.
But the film that I remember seeing there was The Green Berets with John Wayne.
And that was almost laughable.
It was laughable. Couple things is at the end he goes down with a Vietnamese boy to the beach, and they're watching the sunset, and the only way that works is if the sun had risen in the west and was setting in the east.
Right.
And number one, and there was a scene in there where they're calling out. There's a calling out directions to a mortar crew, and they screwed that up immediately,
Well,
and everybody broke out laughing.
I think everybody figured out it was a propaganda film.
Yeah, it
I mean,
very much was.
that's what it was. And John Wayne was ready to, you know
Yeah.
him, he'd jump on that.
Yeah. The thing that there was believe it or not, there was a scene in Forrest Gump where he's in Vietnam that I thought was the best portrayal of what it was like being in an ambush when all of a sudden you hear rockets and you're in a theater with a surround sound and they're literally flying past your ears, an explosion, and the fact that you couldn't see where the people were firing, there was confusion, and basically that's what war is.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of confusion, a lot of, you're taking casualties, but you can't figure out where all of a sudden, and I thought that was incredibly accurate.
And for me, the most accurate was in Platoon, the night ambush patrol that they were on. And it was dark and raining, and everybody had their poncho on them. And Sheen was the guy that was supposed to be awake, and he was up there, and of course, cold, and he nodded off. And lightning, like we had, and you could see the NVA working their way up the trail that they were set up on. And they didn't see him. But then, all of a sudden, they're close, and all of a sudden, somebody pokes him, and they do the claymore, which was not 20 feet out in front of him, and then it was on, and the machine gunner opened up, but they were shooting back. I mean, it was a knee-jerk reaction. The minute that claymore went off, they were shooting, and of course, he was totally disoriented and covering his head and trying to get down behind the berm and everything. And that actually, man, that really got to me. It was raining, lightning, night ambush patrol, somebody going to sleep. I mean, all the elements were there.
Yeah.
And that was just woo.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds you how dangerous those things were.
Yep.
They became commonplace to you because that's what you did every day, or in the case of night ambush patrols every few days. But it doesn't mean it wasn't just as dangerous as it was the first time you did it.
Sure.
You were scared out of your mind.
I have a letter that I'm going to copy and send to you. When we were at Reed Fire Support Base, they had cut out a circle with the dozers right in the middle of the jungle. And they put the bunkers right at the edge of the of the jungle, there was no clearing. There was no buffer between the bunkers and everything. Now, maybe this was, they were going to do it later, or they were doing this in haste. I never figured it out. But because of that, it allowed Charlie every single day, there'd be 60 mortars just lobbed in, 2 or 3, and then it was over. And you couldn't see. And at night, when they'd send you on ambush patrols, the minute you left the wire, you couldn't, you had no, if you didn't know where you were going, you know, you couldn't see back. You couldn't see where the wire was even. And that was one of the craziest setups I'd ever seen. And we actually had 2 sergeants in our platoon. Eichner came and said, you 2 guys are taking the platoon out. And he was going to send them like a clique into the jungle, and they refused. 2 of them. And it was Smokes and Lee Ketchum.
Yeah.
And they just said, you know, this is suicide. And we're responsible for these guys, and we're not, you know, we're not going to do it. And of course he said, okay, that's just going to cost you a stripe and you a stripe. That's how he operated. So they both lost their sergeant stripes, but we didn't go out. So I guess after we left there, then they came in and pulled all the jungle away from the base, and it turned out to be a really nice base. But it was only after we'd been there for a while, and what's the thinking with that? What is the Army thinking?
Yeah, it's a combination of that, and to be honest with you, I was always really impressed how inventive and gutsy the enemy we fought was. I mean, with no air support whatsoever.
Yep.
I mean, no Air Force. I mean, they had MiGs flying in the north against the Phantoms that we were sending in there, but there was nothing in the south.
And they were shooting them down like ducks.
And every flipping bullet they fired, let alone the big mortars, and they had big mortars, and they had heavy machine guns, and they had anti-aircraft guns, and they had rockets, had to be carried, for hundreds and hundreds of miles through very rough terrain, under very trying circumstances. So, you got, and despite all that, they managed to keep the biggest superpower in the world pretty much tied up in knots.
Yep. Look, that's a fact. Yep, that's a fact. You know, and people have asked me, you know, what I thought of the Viet Cong. Well, they were about as smart as they come. I mean, they'd had 100 years of this stuff to get prepared. You know, and when the French, that just boosted their egos something terrible, you know, when they wiped the French out of there. And after I got out of Vietnam, I was reading an article, and it said, you know, Ho Chi Minh actually liked the United States.
Absolutely.
He wanted to incorporate.
He wanted to use our Declaration of Independence to set up his government, and we said, piss off.
I know. But, and I really feel for where we worked. We were with the peasants. We were with the farmers. We were out in the thing. And those poor people.
They took it in the neck.
They couldn't win for losing. And then we wondered why they didn't want to talk to us.
Yeah.
When we showed up.
Yeah.
You know. And so those are just things that I remember about the war, especially when I came home, and I really regretted. You know, because we did some stuff, you know, we burned some hooches, you know, and we were ordered to do it. Nobody just came up with that idea on their own. And, you know, I think some of the villagers were treated less than...
Oh, yeah. There were millions of civilians, Vietnamese killed. I mean, we had 60,000 men killed, and they had, 20 times that many or more.
Yeah.
I mean, it was terrible for them, but...
Well, Cy, thank you.
Appreciate it, buddy.
For sharing your...
Thank you for contacting me 11 years ago.
Oh,
yeah, this has been great. And
so I had a bonus question for you. I know we've only been taping for 2 hours and 85 minutes.
Not a math major, right?
What is your definition of a hero?
You know, it's funny. I don't think of heroes so much as physical bravery. Although I admire people who do that, whether it's firefighters, police officers, soldiers, rescue people, pararescue people, all that kind of thing. But I think of heroes as the people who protect, who look out for a kid, who feed the homeless, who fight against an unpopular cause, and do it, and they're not carrying weapons. People who not carrying weapons who stand up against people who carry weapons. We at least could shoot back. There's people who've done just amazing things like that. But
what does the American flag mean to you?
I appreciate the fact that I was born in this country, number one. I tell people I'm the luckiest guy on earth. I was born at the right place, in the right country, to the right parents, at the right time in history. The first time that World War II had just ended and food was plentiful suddenly, the rationing was off. I was in the one country industrial country that hadn't been destroyed.
Yep.
Penicillin and antibiotics had hit in a big way. They were controlling diseases. And there was a huge amount of opportunity, and businesses were exploding because the United States was providing steel and material and know-how to the rest of the world, because theirs had all been just burned to the ground.
Right.
And to me, I consider it more luck than, just a factor of birth. But I appreciate the fact that I was born here and can figure out pretty easily there were a lot of ways our lives could have been a whole lot worse.
Well, your daughter, you're probably going to be a grandpa someday if you're not already, and one day your granddaughter is going to be probably have children and so forth. What do you think about your daughter bringing up children in this day in 2019? Because it's changed quite a bit from what you just
Absolutely.
said.
And the situation is such that I don't think we're going to see wars the same way that we have before. Wars are going to be people on keyboards who are going to cut off your water supply and cut off your electricity, which I don't. The one thing I'm concerned about in this country is that people don't understand how quickly you are living in the Stone Age without electricity and clean water. And, I was in Vietnam for 2 years, and as I tell people, I never used a flush toilet. And that's not a lot of fun. It's much easier to transit into comfort than to go from comfort back into
you're telling me.
the other direction. And if at the same time you're, whether it's dumping mercury or petroleum or products and fouling your own water and air, then it means you got a smaller area that you can live that's safe, and and the population's 3 times what it was when we were kids. A world population is, and it could get really nasty. Fortunately, you and I are going to be out of here by the time that house of cards collapses.
Yep.
But I fear for the future because of that. Because the darkest days of World War II is that people knew that once that war was over, things were going to be dramatically better and just increasingly get better. But if the natural resources have been trashed so badly, and everybody's pulling in different directions, it could get uglier and uglier all the time. And on that positive note, thank you very much.
You got it, buddy. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for always
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks for always supporting us too.